Hey guys, tonight we're heading straight into a blizzard. You're cold, you're exhausted, and your fingers, yeah, they've basically stopped working. Welcome to the American West, somewhere out between Kansas and Colorado, mid-1800s. The sun dipped behind the horizon 3 hours ago, and the wind has decided your ears don't need skin anymore. You're not a cowboy, yet. You're just you, dropped here with your boots sinking into the snow, watching your breath fog in front of you. You're a settler, or maybe a gold dreamer, or a poor soul who followed a wagon train west and forgot the part about winter being absolutely merciless. And here's the kicker, you probably won't survive this. I mean, unless you learn how to build a shelter, fast. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and what time it is where you're watching from. I always love seeing where people are tuning in from. Makes it feel like we're all warming up together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of a tree line staring at a frozen field that used to be prairie grass. There's no town for 50 miles, no store to buy nails, and no neighbours to complain to. Just you, a few mules, who are not thrilled, and a pile of timber you hoped would build something warm and permanent before the snow hit. Spoiler, it didn't. The West isn't what the movies made it look like. It's colder, meaner, and full of decisions that feel like they matter more than anything you've ever decided in your life. You've got maybe 2 hours of daylight left, a small axe, and a heavy coat that's definitely not rated for this nonsense. The nearest help is too far, and you're going to need a shelter. Not just a place to rest, a place to not die. And that's where this all begins. The earliest Western settlers often weren't trained builders. They were farmers, immigrants, sometimes even children walking next to wagons for weeks. And when they reached the so-called promised land, they had to invent comfort from nothing. People built shelters with what they had on hand. Dirt, trees, stone, sometimes animal skins, and always desperation. Here's a little secret. Most didn't expect the winters to be that bad. Seriously. There were articles in Eastern papers, ads in Europe, touting the plains as open, fertile and gentle. The hard freezes, not in the brochures. So you've got folks from Ireland, Germany, Norway and the eastern seaboard showing up with no idea what a Dakota winter feels like when it sneaks up in early October. And those first winters were killers, literally. There's a reason you hear so many stories about the winter of 1856, or the big freeze of 72. Each generation had one that carved itself into memory. That's why, even tonight, as you trudge through ankle-deep snow to gather firewood, you're also learning survival passed down through whispered advice, and sometimes panicked trial and error. You kneel beside the tree line, chopping branches, stacking what you can into a rough framework. Your fingers go numb before you realise your gloves are damp. That's a rookie mistake. Wet gloves steal body heat faster than snow falling through a hole in your roof. Your breath catches. You need a roof, a real one. But you don't have a sawmill or a toolkit or the time. So what do? You fake it. That's what most pioneers did. They looked at the land and worked backward from whatever was warm, dry and wouldn't blow away at midnight. Dig a hole? Sure. Stack mud bricks? If you can. Roll yourself in buffalo robes inside a pit lined with pine boughs? Absolutely. You press through the task, building something. It won't be pretty. But neither were the earliest shelters of the West. Dugouts, literal holes carved into hillsides, were the first homes for thousands. Why? Because dirt insulates better than wood. A dugout is warmer than a cabin with gaps. You pile snow on top, add brush, and guess what? The inside holds heat. It smells like earth and damp clothes, but it's shelter. Now, not everything about early Western shelter building was rugged brilliance. Sometimes it was straight-up nonsense. There are accounts of people trying to sleep under wagons with blankets of straw, or building teepee-like structures with no chimney flue, so the whole place filled with smoke and tears. It worked until someone passed out from lack of oxygen. There's a fringe story from a Montana diary. A woman who survived a full winter in a snow cave with nothing but a dog and a cast-iron pot. Every day she'd melt snow to drink and roast whatever scraps her dog could sniff out. Was it true? Maybe. Or maybe it was one of those frontier legends designed to scare the next group into taking winter seriously. Either way, point made. And here's something scholars still debate. How much did white settlers borrow from native shelter designs? Some say heavily. Others say not nearly enough. Many tribes already had refined winter survival down to an art. Earth lodges, buffalo hide teepees, and bark huts that were so much more efficient than what settlers built on their own. But because of prejudice and arrogance, a lot of those smarter methods got ignored until people started losing toes. Then suddenly, learning from your neighbour became a lot more appealing. Tonight, as the stars appear, sharp pinpricks in the dark blue canopy, you crouch in your half-finished shelter. It's not much, just some stacked branches, snow-packed walls, and a hole barely big enough to crawl into, but it blocks the wind. It feels warmer already, and that's all you can ask for right now. Your breath is visible. The fire outside is just embers now, and you'll need to guard it through the night, feeding it slowly, trying not to use all your fuel before morning. And while you lie there, cold but alive, you realise this is just the beginning. Tomorrow, you'll need to improve it. Make it better, make it safer. But tonight, you've passed the first test of winter. Barely. The wind hasn't stopped. It's slowed, maybe, but not stopped. When you crawl out of your shelter at first light, the snow crunches under your knees with that dry, powdery snap that only comes from a hard freeze. Your breath hangs in the air again, white and slow like smoke rising from a chimney you wish you had. Your fire is a blackened circle now, its heat long gone, and you realise painfully that this whole thing, surviving in the Wild West, isn't about courage or strength. It's about stubbornness. Quiet, cold, unshakable stubbornness. Because today, you're going to dig. Welcome to the world of dugouts. Not the baseball kind, the hill kind. If you want to stay warm for more than one night, you need walls that don't leak wind, a ceiling that doesn't collapse under snow weight, and an entrance that doesn't invite in every freezing gust and curious raccoon. Dirt does all that, and you've got plenty of it. So you spend the day carving into the side of a slope near your little clearing. It's not glamorous work. Your hands blister around the handle of your shovel, and every rock you hit feels personal, but it's doable. It's smart, honestly. Settlers who didn't have time or materials for cabins often turned to the earth. A dugout could be made in just a few days, sometimes even less if you picked a soft enough spot. Hillside preferred, for drainage. Flatland would work too, but then you had to build up a back wall, and that meant more digging, more timber, more time. You dig until the hole is big enough to crawl into without bumping your head. Then wider, then deeper. The interior becomes your cave, your refuge. The dirt around you holds onto heat in ways that wooden walls can't. It's like the earth is hugging you back reluctantly, and only because it knows winter's worse. You line the floor with dry grass and branches. Tomorrow, maybe you'll try to drag in some logs to support the roof. Maybe even lay a tarp across the top and cover it with sod, snow, or both. But even unfinished, it already feels safer. Historically, dugouts weren't just a desperation move. They were the first real homes for many settlers. Entire families lived in them, sometimes for years. Imagine waking up in a mud-walled room with frost creeping across the ceiling, 2 kids wrapped in quilts next to you and a pot of beans boiling on a smoky little fire. That was daily life. It wasn't cosy, not in the way we romanticize it now. It was damp, dark, and bug-ridden at times. Mice loved them, so did snakes. Still, they held heat better than most above-ground cabins thrown together in a panic. And there were perks. A good dugout could stay above freezing even when the outside dropped below 0. That meant you could store vegetables, sleep without losing fingers, and maybe, just maybe, not wake up covered in ice. Of course, not everyone loved them. There's a fringe story from Nebraska about a family who swore their dugout was haunted, claimed the sounds of digging came from behind the walls at night, even when everyone was inside. Turns out it was just a trapped badger trying to escape, but still, that kind of thing sticks with you. There's also a scholarly debate about the long-term use of dugouts. Some believe settlers moved out as soon as they could build something proper. Others argue that many dugouts became permanent homes, modified and improved until they barely resembled holes in the ground. Some even got wooden front porches and glass windows. Fancy, right? But that's for later. Right now you're building basic survival. You stack flat stones around the base of your fire pit to keep the flames from escaping. You leave a gap near the top of your entrance tunnel, just a narrow slit, to let smoke out and draw fresh air in. It's not perfect. You cough when the wind shifts and the smoke comes back inside, but it's better than being out in the open. That night you sleep pressed against the wall of your dugout, wrapped in a blanket that smells like mule and wood smoke. It's warmer than yesterday. Your feet still ache, and your back is furious, but you sleep anyway. Not well, but you sleep. The next morning you wake up to silence. No wind, no birds, just cold air and stillness, like the land is holding its breath. You step outside and see that the snow has covered your tracks. Your shelter looks like a dark wound in the hill, almost invisible from a distance, and that, you realize, is another benefit. Out here, it's not just the cold that can kill you. It's people, desperate ones, hungry ones, and the animals don't care for your suffering either. Being hard to find? That's survival strategy too. You spend the day gathering more firewood. You learn to look for dry branches high up in dead trees. Wet wood hisses and smokes but gives no heat. You tie a bundle with rope and drag it back to your dugout. You're learning. Slowly. But it's happening. That night you set your fire carefully, place hot stones near your bedding, and cover the entrance with a wool blanket weighted with snow. The inside of your dugout traps the heat. Not sauna warm, but warm enough that you don't shiver. You eat something hot for the first time in days, beans again, but this time with salt and a little dried meat. It tastes like victory. Your shelter is ugly. It smells like smoke and wet dirt. But it's yours. And out here, that means everything. The third morning begins with a shiver running up your spine before your eyes even open. You're cold, but not panicked. Progress. Your breath clouds the air inside the dugout, which means it's cold enough to see it, but not cold enough to crystallize your eyelashes shut like it was 2 nights ago. You've got a fire going already, smouldering low, and that glow means one crucial thing. You're doing this. You're actually surviving. But you also know the dugout is a temporary win, a patch, a mud-smeared band-aid for a much bigger wound. You've seen the logs nearby, towering cottonwoods down by the frozen creek. Some have already fallen, nature doing you a favour. Others are just waiting to be chopped. And now that your body isn't in full panic mode, your brain starts asking, can you build something better? Something above ground? Something with walls that don't cave in when the spring melt starts pouring down the hill? You can't help but picture it. A log cabin. A real one. Not the polished kind from storybooks or national parks, but the raw, uneven, wind-blocking fortress that's kept pioneers alive for centuries. You're ready to try. Chopping wood isn't just hard, it's spiritual. You learn quickly that every swing matters. Wasted strength is wasted time, and out here you don't have enough of either. You fall into a rhythm. Axe, crack, breathe, repeat. The sound echoes through the valley like some old heartbeat of civilization slowly dragging itself out of the wilderness. Historically, log cabins were the gold standard of frontier shelters. Settlers from Scandinavia and Eastern Europe brought the knowledge with them, passing down log-building techniques that worked in the frozen forests of Norway and the snow-heavy plains of Ukraine. It wasn't just stacking logs and hoping they stuck together. It was joinery, craftsmanship, precision. Even when the tools were crude, the planning wasn't. You drag the first logs up the hill with your mule, who by the way hates this job and is very clear about it. You notch the ends of the logs with your axe, carving out saddle joints so they lock into each other at the corners. It's not perfect, but that's the beauty of it. A log cabin forgives a lot of mistakes. As long as the walls are thick, the chinking is tight, and the roof doesn't collapse. Chinking. That's the real magic. You take mud, straw, moss, or whatever you can find, and you shove it into the gaps between the logs. It seals out the wind, keeps in the heat, and gives your shelter that rustic, slightly mouldy charm that all the best cabins have. The floor? Still dirt. You're not royalty. But maybe later, you'll lay some planks or even stone slabs if you're feeling fancy. Right now, you just need walls, a door, and a roof that doesn't dump snow into your stew. Now here's the quirky part. Some folks used to smear animal blood into the chinking mix, not for warmth, but to keep insects and rodents out. Apparently the smell warned off pests. Others would tuck bits of tobacco or burn sulphur to chase away mites and flies. Is it weird? Absolutely. Did it work? Debatable. But in an age before bug spray, people got creative. As your walls climb higher, you start feeling something you haven't felt since arriving. Control. This isn't just surviving anymore, this is building, choosing, acting, instead of reacting. You imagine hanging a lantern from the centre beam, setting a kettle over a proper stone hearth, maybe even carving your name into the doorframe like this is a place you'll stay. And here's where scholars like to squabble. Were cabins better than dugouts for first winters? Some argue no, that the speed and insulation of a dugout gave settlers a better shot in year one, especially if they arrived late in the season. Others argue that even a half-finished cabin was psychologically better, something that looked like progress, something you could expand on. You think, maybe both are true. Dugouts are for immediate survival, cabins are for commitment. One keeps you from dying, the other lets you start living again. You finish the 4 walls in 5 exhausting days. By now, your hands are raw, your shoulders feel like they've been chewed on by bears, and your mule has started walking away when you pick up a rope. But the cabin stands, bare, brown, sturdy. You sleep inside for the first time that night, curled up near the centre with your fire burning low in a ring of stones. You wake up to condensation dripping from the inside of the roof. It's too airtight in here. There's no vent yet, no chimney. The smoke clings to the ceiling like it's trying to live here too. You cough for a while, then crawl outside where the morning air tastes like ice and pine needles. Building the roof is your next challenge. You've got 2 options, go simple or go suicidal. A flat roof is easy, but it'll collapse under snow. A steep pitch requires more logs, more effort, and more math. You go somewhere in between, enough of a slant to shed snow, low enough to not kill you if you misstep. You use poles for rafters, lay bark across the top, then pile sod and snow over that for insulation. It's primitive, heavy, but shockingly effective. Snow on the roof acts like a natural blanket, thick, quiet, protective. You sit back and watch the smoke curl up through a tiny hole you left open. Finally, it feels like a home. Now, funny thing, some of the earliest cabins didn't have doors, just blankets. Doors came later, when wolves or snowdrifts or bored neighbours started sneaking in uninvited. You go ahead and hang a crude slab of wood from old leather straps just in case. That night the wind howls like it knows you've won something, but inside your log walls with the fire burning and your face warmed by orange flickering light, it doesn't matter. You've built your fortress, and for now, that's enough. The wind is screaming again. You can hear it clawing at your roof, rattling the wooden door you rigged up with worn leather and a half-rusted hinge. But this time, you don't flinch. You're not crouched behind a drift, hoping the cold doesn't eat your toes. No, you're in your cabin, your lopsided, smoky, drafty miracle, and you're almost warm. The fire crackles in the stone-ringed hearth, and every now and then a log pops like it's laughing at the storm outside. You stretch out, wrapped in your stiff wool blanket, staring at the ceiling where the smoke tries to escape through the roof vent. This is progress. This is survival in style. Well, frontier style. And then a chunk of mud falls from the wall. You groan. Cabin life, it turns out, has its own sense of humour. Your chinking is starting to dry out and crumble in places. You can feel a sliver of cold wind dragging across your ankles. You roll over and wedge some dried moss into the gap. Good enough, for now. You think back to something you heard, maybe in passing, maybe in a story. Sod houses. Soddies, they were called. Half joke, half miracle. Back on the plains, where trees were rarer than honest salesmen, people built entire homes out of dirt and grass. Literally. They'd cut bricks of sod, those thick mats of soil and grass roots, and stack them like stone. Sound ridiculous? Yeah, but it worked. You've seen it done once, a lifetime ago, back when you passed through Kansas and thought you'd never need to know how to build a house from lawn. Yet here you are. The idea gnaws at you, not because you want to ditch your cabin, but because you're already thinking about what comes next. Maybe you'll have to move, maybe the weather gets worse, maybe the cabin just doesn't hold. It wouldn't hurt to understand how people manage to turn grass into shelter. So let's walk through it. You take a trip in your imagination now, heading south and east across the plains. The sky is huge, too huge, and the wind never stops. You see families standing in endless golden fields with spades and saws, cutting sod into perfect rectangles about 3 feet long, a foot wide, and 4 inches thick. The best stuff came from native prairie grasses, because their roots were deep and tangled. That mat of roots held the soil together like rebar in concrete. The sod bricks were heavy, wet. A single home could take thousands of them, but people stacked them anyway, interlocking them in staggered rows, like building a Lego house with muddy, root-filled blocks. And the result? Walls that were thick, sturdy, and incredibly insulating. A good sod house could keep you cooler in summer, and warmer in winter than a poorly built log cabin. The roots even helped prevent erosion, making the walls surprisingly stable through storms. Of course, it wasn't glamorous. The inside of a soddy smelled like dirt. Bugs came and went as they pleased. When it rained, parts of the ceiling could drip for hours. There are stories, some funny, some horrifying, about snakes slithering through the walls at night, mice nesting above headboards, and centipedes falling from ceiling cracks onto unsuspecting foreheads. Cozy, right? One odd story comes from the Dakota Territory. A woman reportedly woke to find a patch of wildflowers growing out of the roof directly above her bed. Turns out some of the sod hadn't fully died and decided to bloom midwinter thanks to the heat from the fire. A little colour, sure, but she moved her bed anyway. You also hear whispers of a more heated debate. Were sod houses inferior to wooden cabins, or simply adapted to their environment? Some historians argue that soddies were a temporary fix for desperate families, while others claim they were smart, sustainable, and sometimes even preferred. Some were improved over time with plastered walls, proper wooden floors, and even glass windows. A few became full-blown homes, passed down through generations until the arrival of railroads brought lumber and change. Back in your cabin, you consider it all while feeding the fire. The idea of a sod house feels possible. You've got soil, you've got grass. If the worst happened, if this roof caved in or you needed to relocate fast, it might be your best shot. But for now, you're going to borrow an idea from the soddy crowd. Insulation. You pull on your coat and step outside into the teeth of the wind. The snow is blowing sideways and your boots sink with every step, but you head toward the hill anyway. You scrape together a load of frozen grass and snow, mix in some dirt from the dugout, and start packing it against the outside of your cabin walls. The cold helps, freezes it into place. You do the same along the base inside, stuffing moss and dirt into every drafty gap. You're layering now, just like they did. Your home is turning into a hybrid, a log cabin with a sod coat. You don't care how it looks. You care how it feels. And tonight, when you hunker down inside again, you notice it right away. Less draft, less chill. The air feels stiller, heavier, like the outside world is just that, outside. It's a strange kind of peace, this life. You spend hours scraping together basic comfort, just to sleep under a ceiling that might drop a mouse on your face. You cook beans again, because it's easy. You drink melted snow, boiled to safety. You don't know what day it is anymore, but you measure progress by how many nights you've stayed warm. You think about the people who came before you, sitting in their grass brick homes, bundled in everything they owned, hoping the next storm wouldn't cave in their roof or sweep their cow into the next county. They weren't heroes. They were just people trying to stay alive. And that somehow is comforting, because if they could do it, so can you. You lie back against the wall, smoke curling toward the ceiling, and let the storm howl outside. You've got fire, a roof, and now just enough dirt in your life to say you're doing it the old-fashioned way. The storm hasn't let up, not really. It's quieter now, more of a whispering wind than a howl, but you can still hear it curling around the edges of your cabin like it's checking for weaknesses. And if it finds one, it'll slip right through. Make no mistake. Cold in the west doesn't need an invitation. It finds the tiniest crack and moves in like it owns the place. You tighten the leather strap holding your door shut, tug your coat tighter around your shoulders, and listen to the fire spit and hiss as it eats what's left of your kindling pile. Today, you need more than just warmth. You need a plan for what happens when the next big freeze comes before you're ready. Because what if you're not here when it hits? What if you're travelling, hunting, miles from any kind of structure? That's when you need to think like a different kind of survivor, someone who doesn't just build homes but lives inside cold like it's a second skin. You're talking about tents, not the kind you'd use on a summer camping trip pitched on flat ground next to a babbling brook. No, you're thinking of heavy canvas, wood poles, and sheer willpower. You're thinking of winter tent living, which, to the untrained eye, looks like voluntary misery. But to someone experienced, it's an art form, so you imagine it. You're out on the trail. Maybe you're trapping. Maybe you're following a herd. Maybe you're just too far from home and snow starts falling fast. The trees are bare, the wind cuts low across the ground, and you've only got your pack, your tools, and whatever gear you could carry. If you can set up a proper canvas tent, dig yourself in a little, and get a fire going, maybe with a small iron stove, you've got a fighting chance. Historically, winter tents were used by all kinds of people out west. Surveyors, miners, military scouts, mountain men, even travelling preachers. The trick was weight versus warmth. Canvas was heavy, sure, but it could handle wind and shed snow better than leather or wool. It also didn't trap moisture the way hides did, which was crucial. A damp tent in freezing temperatures turns into an icebox fast. So here's what you'd do. You find a slight depression in the ground, maybe a little hollow between trees, out of the wind. You set your poles and stretch your canvas tight, but the real work starts after that. You dig down, always dig down, a few feet at least. Carve out a pit and pitch your tent over it. The earth offers natural insulation, and if you line the floor with pine boughs or even dried grass, you keep your body off the frozen ground, a lifesaver at night. You stack snow along the base of the tent to seal the edges, using it like bricks to anchor everything. Snow's not just cold, it's structure. Used right, it can act like mortar, filling gaps and blocking wind. Then you start your fire, either outside with a small windbreak or, if you're lucky enough to have one, inside with a collapsible stove and stovepipe punched through a corner of the tent wall. One story comes to mind, a bit of a frontier oddity. There was a pair of brothers who travelled through Utah every winter selling potions, the kind that cured everything from gout to heartbreak. They lived out of a single canvas tent for months, claiming their breath alone kept it warm. Locals said it was more likely the 6 bottles of whiskey they carried. Either way, they survived, and their tent patched with bearskin and old wagon tarp became a local legend. Not all tent tales ended so charmingly. There are accounts of sudden storms trapping travellers under collapsed canvases, suffocating fires and snowdrifts burying people alive while they slept. That's the trade-off. A tent is mobile, flexible, but it has to be watched. You're constantly adjusting, checking tension, knocking snow off the roof, listening for that dangerous silence that means something heavy just landed up top. There's also debate among historians about whether tents were practical long-term shelters. Some argue they were strictly emergency solutions. Others point to trappers and nomadic families who lived in tents for entire winters, relying on experience, layered bedding, and fire management to stay alive. Some even claim tent dwellers fared better than some cabin dwellers, because they stayed mobile, moving with the game and the weather instead of getting buried in one place. Back in your world, you test the theory. You drag your old canvas tarp out from where it's folded under a crate, bundle it with rope, and mark a spot in your clearing, just in case. Maybe you'll need it one day. Maybe you'll be away from your cabin when the sky turns white and the cold starts hunting again. You try pitching it, just for practice. You drive stakes into the half-frozen ground, stretch the corners, and weigh the edges with snow and stones. It's not elegant, but it holds. You sit inside for a while, your fire pit a tiny ring of warmth, and imagine what it would feel like to stay here through a night. The truth is, it wouldn't be comfortable, but comfort isn't what keeps you alive out here. Adaptability does. Willpower does. A good knife, dry tinder, and the knowledge that every night you spend above ground is a victory. Before you go back to your cabin, you do one more thing. Dig a small shelf into the wall of your snow pit and set a few stones on it. It's a little trick you read about somewhere. Heat the stones in your fire, then slide them onto the shelf at night. They radiate warmth long after the flames go out. It's not magic, but it feels like it. The wind is picking up again as you return to your log walls, duck through your heavy door and stoke the fire. You shake the snow from your coat and boots, feeling it melt into your socks, and let out a slow, tired sigh. Outside, a tent stands under the stars, rough, cold, ready. Inside, you're learning more each day, and maybe that's what survival really is, a slow, stubborn education, taught one frozen finger at a time. It's just before dawn when you hear it, something moving outside. Not wind this time, not the usual creaks and groans of snow shifting on branches, or your cabin roof settling. This is different, softer, more intentional. You sit up slowly, every joint stiff, and reach for the hatchet you keep by your side. The fire's gone down to embers, casting faint red glows across the dirt floor, and for a long moment you just listen. Then it comes again, crunch, pause, crunch. You exhale. Not a person. A 4-legged shuffle. Probably a deer, maybe something bolder. You've heard stories, some true, some exaggerated, of wolves sniffing out weak walls, mountain lions dragging off sleeping goats, or bears pressing their noses to canvas in search of leftover stew. But not this time. Whatever it is, it's not trying to come in. Just passing by. Maybe you're lucky. You lie back, letting your pulse settle, and stare up at the ceiling. Smoke stains have started painting streaks across the wood, curling in ghostly wisps where the fire tried to climb higher. You trace them with your eyes, thinking about all the others who slept under such ceilings. Fur trappers, mostly. People who didn't have permanent homes. People who made the wilderness itself into shelter. You're not quite a trapper, but out here, labels get fuzzy, and their way of life starts to make a lot more sense, because long before settlers came rolling through with wagons and ambition, trappers were carving out space in the cold using bark, moss, hide, and grit. Their shelters, primitive genius. Sometimes it was just a lean-to made from pine boughs. Sometimes it was a full-on winter hut, insulated with mud and lined with animal skins. You try to imagine building one, how it would feel to create something not from plans but instinct. To read the forest, not just use it. You step outside with your coat pulled tight and your boots crunching over snow that's developed a thin ice crust. The animal that passed by left tracks, wide, soft-edged, not a predator. Maybe a moose or an elk. You follow them out of curiosity, letting your mind drift to the old ways. Fur trappers, especially in the Rockies and Northern Territories, didn't haul lumber around. They built with what they found. One popular design was the brush lodge, a simple A-frame made with interlocked branches, thick thatch, and snow piled up along the base to block the wind. If they stayed longer, they'd dig into a slope, create a back wall of packed dirt, and line the inside with hides. The best ones had fire pits dug into the floor with a hole above for smoke to rise. No chimney, just a gap, and a prayer the wind didn't change direction mid-dinner. You find a spot by the tree line and start sketching in the snow with a stick, not because you need another shelter right now, but because you want to understand how it all works. You draw a rough outline of a lodge, maybe 8 feet long, 5 wide. You mark where the branches would cross, where the fire pit would go, where the hides would hang. It's crude, but it feels right, like you're learning from ghosts. One particularly strange but brilliant method trappers used, bark shingles. Aspen bark, peeled in long strips, was laid over frame structures to form a roof that shed snow surprisingly well. When nailed or tied down, the bark curled just enough to overlap, creating a water-resistant surface. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't durable, but it lasted just long enough to get through winter. Then there were the skins. Buffalo hide, if you were lucky. Deer or elk, more common. Trappers often carried a few tanned hides rolled up with their gear, not for trading, but for surviving. One hide over the doorway, another lining the sleeping area, a third draped over the roof to trap warmth. In emergencies, they'd even sleep inside the hides, burrito style, with hot stones tucked in for warmth. You picture it, rolling into a skin, sweating in one spot, freezing in another, trying not to dream about falling asleep next to your own smouldering rock pillow. There's an old legend, probably exaggerated, about a trapper in Montana who built a shelter entirely from beaver pelts. Supposedly it kept him warmer than any cabin he'd ever slept in, until a group of desperate thieves tried to skin the shelter while he was still inside it. The moral? Even in the wilderness, success makes you a target. Some scholars still debate just how widespread these bark and hide shelters really were. Were they common, or just used by the most remote loner types, the mountain men of legend and beard? It's hard to know because so few physical examples survive. These shelters melted back into the forest by spring, temporary by design. But the stories remain. Journals from French-Canadian trappers mention moss-lined huts that smelled like pine sap and bear fat. Others describe sleeping under suspended hides, swinging like hammocks from branch to branch to stay off the frozen ground. And yet, for all their improvisation, trappers weren't reckless. They knew the signs, what clouds meant a snowstorm was coming, how to pick a camp facing away from the prevailing wind, where to find dead trees dry enough for kindling even in a blizzard. They weren't just rugged, they were observant, patient, and maybe that's the lesson that hits hardest out here. You return to your cabin after an hour wandering in the woods, hands red and stiff, your breath fogging the air in long, tired bursts. Inside, the fire has dimmed, but the stones still glow with heat. You sit beside them, rubbing your palms together, thinking of bark huts and hide roofs and smoke holes that work if you're lucky and careful. You don't have buffalo hides, but you do have old blankets, and tonight you hang one over your cabin door, tacking it up with wood scraps and a few rusted nails. It doesn't look like much. But the draft stops. just a little, and in the quiet that follows, you realise you're becoming something different. Not just a settler, not just a survivor. You're becoming someone who listens to the cold, understands it, adapts to it, like the trappers did, like the land demands, because winter doesn't care how smart you are, but it will reward your respect. You wake to quiet, not silence. Real silence doesn't exist out here, but the kind of hush that blankets everything after a heavy snow. The wind is gone, the trees are motionless, and the world outside your cabin glows with that strange bluish light that only fresh snow can summon. You push open your door, slowly since the snow has drifted halfway up the frame, and step outside into knee-deep powder. Everything looks softer, muted, except for the cold which has never been sharper. Today, you're not building. You're learning. Because there's something you can't ignore anymore. No matter how many logs you stack or how much moss you cram into the walls, someone else did it better, centuries before you. And you start thinking about the original survivors of these winters, the people who never had to relearn how to live with the cold. They were already experts. Indigenous nations across the West had been building winter shelters long before fur traders or settlers showed up swinging axes and grumbling about frostbite. You wander through the forest, boots crunching through crusted snow, and imagine what it would have been like to build a lodge. Not from lumber hauled on wagons or bricks of sod, but from raw, native materials selected with intention. The kind of construction that speaks to generations of adaptation. That's where you begin to appreciate just how advanced, and frankly superior, some of these indigenous winter shelters really were. Take the Earth Lodge, for example. Used by plains tribes like the Mandan and Hidatsa, these homes were part underground, part dome, and entirely genius. First, they'd dig a shallow pit into the earth, circular, maybe 20 feet across. Then they'd raise a framework of heavy timber poles leaning inward, meeting at the top like the ribs of a great wooden beast. Over that went willow branches, layers of grass, and finally, thick piles of earth. Dirt on top of wood. It sounds unstable, but it wasn't. In fact, the heavier the snow fell, the more insulated the structure became, like an igloo made of soil. You picture stepping inside one of these lodges, a central fire pit, smoke rising through a hole in the roof, sleeping platforms built along the edges, each one stacked with furs and thick blankets. The walls are silent, the cold muffled by layers of sod, and even on the coldest night it holds warmth like a buried ember. No wind, no drafts, no wood shrinking and cracking from the cold. Just stillness and heat. You keep walking, and your thoughts turn to teepees, not just for summer use, despite what people assume. When built with proper insulation and maintained correctly, teepees were astonishingly effective in the winter. Buffalo hides stretched over conical poles, lined with more hides or grass mats, and anchored into the snow for stability. The smoke flap at the top could be adjusted for wind direction, and a fire inside, carefully managed, kept things livable even in sub-zero conditions. And here's the kicker. Teepees were portable. They could be broken down, packed, and moved with the seasons. Entire villages would relocate when food sources shifted or weather patterns changed. That kind of mobility was survival strategy, not just convenience. Meanwhile, settlers were digging frozen potatoes out of the ground with bare hands and praying their cabins didn't collapse under snow. There's a story, half real, half myth, from the northern plains about a trader who stumbled into a Lakota camp during a blizzard. He was frostbitten, delirious, and had lost 2 fingers to the cold. They brought him into a tipi, wrapped him in robes, and within an hour he was sweating. Not just warm, sweating. He stayed with them all winter, and when spring came, refused to leave. Said their shelters were better than anything he'd ever built. Maybe he wasn't wrong. Even now, scholars argue about just how thermally efficient these indigenous designs were. Some claim that with proper construction and fire placement, a winter teepee could maintain temperatures of 60 degrees Fahrenheit or more while it was below zero outside. Others point out that success depended on materials. Buffalo hide was best, but scarce after white hunters decimated herds. Either way, there's no denying these structures were designed with a deep understanding of climate and resource. You pause by a fallen tree sitting on its snow-dusted trunk and think about how you've done everything the hard way so far. You built a dugout, then a log cabin, wrestled with fire that smokes more than it heats, and still find yourself layering up just to fall asleep. Meanwhile, someone 100 years ago could have built a snow-tight lodge using nothing but grass, mud, and memory. The most overlooked trick? Passive design. Indigenous winter shelters were often oriented with intention. Entrances faced away from prevailing winds. Overhangs or snowbanks were placed strategically to trap heat and reflect sunlight. They didn't fight the cold with brute force. They redirected it, flowed around it, designed with it in mind. You return to your cabin that afternoon with a new itch in your brain. Not envy, respect. You want to incorporate what you've learned, so you start small. First, you build a windbreak, a semicircle of logs and branches just outside your door, stacked against the prevailing wind to help buffer the gusts that steal your fire's warmth every time the door swings open. Then you take some spare branches and start weaving a crude inner lining, trapping dry grass between the log walls and this new barrier. It's not beautiful. But neither is freezing. And that night, it works. The cabin holds heat longer. You find yourself peeling off your outer layer for the first time in days. The blanket of cold outside feels distant now, pushed back by nothing more than placement, layering, and a few tricks stolen from smarter people. It's humbling. You're not reinventing anything. You're catching up. So you sit by your fire, a little more comfortable, a little more alive, and wonder how many things you still haven't figured out. The answer? Plenty. But now you know who to learn from. The snow finally stops falling sometime during the night. You know not because it got warmer, because it didn't, but because the silence shifted. That gentle static of drifting flakes disappears, leaving only the groan of the trees under their frozen load and the occasional thump as a branch gives up and drops its burden to the forest floor. You lie awake listening, swaddled in every layer you own, feeling the warmth of your own breath curl back into your face under the blanket. You don't dare move, not yet, because this is the moment when the cold is deepest, right before sunrise, when even the fire seems reluctant to wake. But wake it does. You coax the embers back to life with bits of bark and a prayer, and soon the flames are licking at the blackened logs. The heat barely touches the air at first, only melting the frost from your boots and turning your breath into steam, but you take what you can get. You're still here, still alive, and that's something. Today, your thoughts wander out past the trees, past your own shelter, past even the old cabins and trappers' huts. You start thinking about people who survived winter without permanent walls at all. The nomadic tribes of the Great Plains, those who moved with the seasons, hunted with the herds, and somehow managed to face winters without planting roots or freezing to death. How did they do it? Buffalo mostly. The bison was more than meat. It was shelter, clothing, tools, fuel, and identity. The entire winter survival strategy of many nomadic tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche centered around the buffalo, and not just the hide, though that was essential. They used nearly every part: horn, bone, sinew, even the dung. Out on the plains, where trees were scarce and winters came in fast, that kind of full-use efficiency wasn't optional, it was life. You imagine it now. A wide, frozen prairie stretching endlessly in every direction, wind barreling across with nothing to stop it. And in the centre, a small cluster of teepees, their conical shapes slicing the air, their buffalo hide coverings drawn tight. Inside it's dark, smoky, warm. Not toasty, but warm enough to survive. Warm enough to cook, sleep, raise children. You try to picture yourself there, in a world without nails or saws, building your shelter from muscle memory and what the land provides. The buffalo hides were treated carefully, tanned with brain and smoke, stitched together with sinew, reinforced with extra layers for winter. A standard teepee might use 10 to 12 hides. A winter-ready one, 15 or more overlapping for insulation. And inside they'd line the walls with additional robes or grass mats. The fire in the centre burned low and steady, and the smoke rose through an adjustable opening at the top. A system more advanced than most settler chimneys, honestly. You remember reading that a properly maintained teepee could be taken down, packed up and reassembled in under an hour by a practiced group. Try doing that with a log cabin. The flexibility wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Nomadic tribes moved with the rhythm of the land, not in defiance of it. When the buffalo moved, they followed. When the snows came, they were ready, because they didn't treat winter like an enemy. They treated it like a season, a fact, something to be respected, not conquered, and they didn't burn wood to stay warm, at least not where there wasn't any. They burned buffalo chips, dried dung, Out here that sounds horrifying to someone raised on fireplaces and firewood, but it's actually brilliant. Buffalo dung, once dried, burns clean, steady, and without the smoke of wet wood. It was collected during the warmer months and stored in baskets or simple piles, ready to fuel fires when the snow fell. You pick one up yourself out of curiosity. Not fresh, obviously, just one left behind and dried long ago. It's hard, almost weightless, like wood that forgot to be a tree. You toss it into your fire as a test, and to your mild surprise it burns. No smell, just heat. There's a strange beauty in it. This idea that nothing was wasted, not even the waste itself, and that maybe more than anything separates your survival attempts from theirs. You're trying to impose comfort on the land. They lived within it. You build barriers. They built tools. There's a fringe story about a particularly harsh winter in the plains, sometime in the 1830s, where a group of Cheyenne families survived weeks of isolation by constructing snow walls around their teepees, stacking the drifts with carved buffalo ribs as reinforcement. Supposedly, the walls stayed upright even as the snow melted, turning the site into something between a camp and a sculpture garden. No one knows if it's true, but you want it to be. There's something poetic about that kind of adaptation, making beauty from hardship. You sit by your fire and glance around your cabin. It's strong, solid, but heavy. Static, rooted in one place. You think about how you'd move it if you had to. The answer is, you wouldn't. Not without tearing it down, not without leaving most of it behind. But the nomads? They packed their shelter onto a travway, tied it to a horse or dog, and were gone by morning. No scraps, no waste, just motion. There's still debate among historians about how much these mobile shelters could truly withstand. Some argue they were only sufficient with constant maintenance, replacing hides, patching holes, rotating positions to stay warm. Others say the key wasn't in the shelter alone, but in the culture that supported it. People knew how to dress, how to sleep close, how to store heat in their bodies. Shelter wasn't just a building, it was a behaviour. You chew on that thought all afternoon, even as you gather more wood and test out lining your cabin's walls with spare hides and old blankets, mimicking the way a teepee would trap heat by layering materials. You bundle hot stones and cloth and place them under your bedding. Not perfect, but noticeably better. That night you sleep in layers, tucked tight, one hand resting near the warmest spot on the floor. Outside, the moon paints the snow in silver, and you lie still, thinking about people moving across the land without fences, without firewood stacks, without any delusion that the land owed them anything. And you begin to wonder if surviving winter isn't about what you build, but how willing you are to change, how closely you're willing to listen to a season that doesn't care about your plans. There's something quietly humiliating about running out of firewood in the middle of the night. You feel it as soon as you wake, the air sharp and bitter, the kind of cold that creeps into your lungs before your eyes even open. The fire has died. Again. You swear under your breath, even though no one's around to hear it, and drag yourself from your nest of blankets to check the hearth. Ash and a few stubborn embers. That's it. You shove in the last of your dry kindling and blow on it like your life depends on it. Because it does. Eventually the fire sputters back to life, coughing sparks like it's annoyed to be woken. You watch it catch, huddled close, hands numb despite your gloves. Outside, the wind's howling again, which means dragging in more wood will be slow, frozen work. And the pile, it's dwindling. You're burning more than you expected, and gathering takes longer every day. The snow's deeper. The trees are crusted over. Even dead limbs are hiding under layers of ice. And it hits you. You've been living like the forest owes you fire. It doesn't. That's when you remember something someone told you once. Might have been in a book or maybe around a campfire. You don't need wood to make fire. You need fuel, and not all fuel grows on trees. You step outside, bracing against the wind, and start looking at your landscape differently. What else can burn? Turns out quite a lot. In treeless stretches of the West, particularly in places like eastern Montana, the Dakota Plains, and parts of Wyoming, settlers and nomads alike learned to get creative. Wood wasn't always an option, especially in winter. But fire was non-negotiable. That's where buffalo chips, sagebrush, and even twisted grass came into play. You already tried a buffalo chip yesterday and were mildly amazed by how well it worked. Now you start collecting them for real, brushing off the snow and tossing them into a leather sack. They're dry, they're everywhere, and they burn steady. Not hot like a log, but with less smoke and more consistency than you expected. Some trappers called them prairie coal, not as romantic as birch logs crackling in a hearth, but far more reliable when the nearest tree is a 2-day walk away. You also find sagebrush, gnarled, low shrubs poking up through the snow, their twisted arms tough and dry. The wood burns fast and hot, almost too fast, but it's perfect for starting fires or boosting a slow flame. Twisting grass into tight bundles takes time, patience, and more hand strength than you'd think. But once rolled and dried, the bundles work like logs, sort of. They need a lot of tending, but they give you options. Out here, options mean survival. There's a strange sense of satisfaction in building a fire from something that shouldn't burn well. You sit by the hearth later, feeding it a mix of sage, dung, and twisted bundles, and feel like you've cheated death just a little, like you've outsmarted winter for one more night. And here's the weird part. Some people preferred it this way. There are letters and journals from homesteaders who claimed they liked the smell of buffalo chip fires. Said it reminded them of baked earth or dry grass after a storm. Others disagreed, swore it stank like sin, and only burned it with the windows open, even in January. Like most frontier things, it depended on your attitude. Were you desperate or just practical? You read once about a family in Nebraska who heated their entire sod house for a full winter with nothing but corn cobs and dried sunflower stalks. Their cabin was near the edge of farmland, and the only trees had been cut years before. They stacked the cobs like firewood, lit them in small batches, and rationed the stalks for the coldest nights. It wasn't cosy, but it worked. And when spring came, their neighbours, who had burned through every splinter of wood, were begging for spare cobs. Of course, there's debate among scholars about how sustainable these alt fuels really were. Some argue that reliance on buffalo dung, for instance, was only viable when herds were nearby, which, thanks to overhunting, didn't last long. Others claim it was more about seasonality. You collected fuel during the warm months, stored it in large piles near your shelter, and rationed like you would flour or salt. The more creative you got, the better your odds. You decide to start your own experiment. Over the next few days, you create a makeshift fuel pile, not just logs, though you still gather those when you can, but a mix of whatever burns. You dry bundles of twisted grass near the fire, stack buffalo chips in a crate, and test which burns longer, sagebrush or dry bark. Spoiler, sage wins. But only just. The pile grows. So does your confidence. You're still cold most nights, still rationing matches and counting every ember like it's gold. But the desperation starts to fade, because now you have options. Now you've learned that warmth doesn't always come from where you expect. And here's the real kicker. The more you learn to rely on these unconventional fuels, the more energy you have for everything else. You're not spending half your day hauling logs from miles away. You're not wasting time and body heat chopping dead trees in knee-deep snow. You're building smarter, not harder. And in the West, that's a survival tactic in itself. That night, as your fire burns with an odd but comforting mix of sage and dung, you listen to the wind press against your walls and feel the difference. Not in temperature, but in rhythm. The fire crackles differently now, less frantic. Like it knows you've stopped playing defense. Like it respects that you've adapted. You wrap yourself tighter in your blanket, take one last look at the glowing coals, and let your body relax. You're not warm, not exactly, but you're not scared anymore either. And out here, that's close enough. The cold changes when you're not alone. It's still brutal, still seeps into your bones, but it feels less personal, less like an enemy that's targeting just you. That's something you notice immediately as the bunkhouse comes into view. A squat, low-roofed structure sitting at the edge of a half-frozen creek, puffing smoke into the grey sky like it's breathing. You spot it from a distance while out tracking for kindling and maybe something edible, and even before you hear the noise, boots thudding on floorboards, the faint murmur of voices, you feel the pull. Warmth. Human warmth. You approach slow. It's not your place, not your people, but out here there's an unspoken law. If it's winter and you're freezing and someone has fire, they don't turn you away. At least not right away. The door creaks open before you reach it. A grizzled ranch hand in a patched coat squints at you, says nothing, just jerks his chin toward the interior. You nod, step inside, and you're hit with it. Heat, laughter, the sour tang of wet socks drying too close to the fire, and the unmistakable smell of people trying not to die together. The bunkhouse isn't fancy. It's a single room, long and narrow, with rows of rough-hewn bunks built into the walls, one above the other like shelves made for sleeping. The fire roars at the far end, inside a stone hearth blackened with soot and age. There are maybe 8 men here, a few wrapped in blankets, one mending a boot, another spooning beans from a dented tin. None of them stop what they're doing to welcome you, but no one throws you out either. That's about as friendly as it gets. And as you settle in near the heat, you realise something important. This huddled, chaotic, elbow-to-elbow living is how a lot of winter was survived in the Wild West. Not with sturdy cabins or clever insulation or thermal theories, with bodies, with bunkhouses. Built quickly and in bulk during cattle booms, bunkhouses were often slapped together with minimal materials, plank walls, a low roof, and a single stove. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed to hold warmth and people, preferably both. Ranchers knew that isolated cowhands froze, but 10 cowhands crammed into one structure might sweat. You glance around. There's no privacy, no room for it. One man's boots are stuffed under another's bunk, and you can't even tell whose blanket is whose. But it works. Their breath fogs the air slightly, but no one's shivering. Body heat, plus a fire, plus thick walls. That's the formula. One of the men offers you a piece of jerky without a word. You nod thanks, chew slowly, and let your senses adjust. The bunkhouse has a rhythm. Every few minutes, someone gets up to feed the fire or roll a cigarette or grumble about the weather. Every hour or so, someone goes out to check the horses, then slams back in covered in snow and profanity. It's a cycle, a dance, and it keeps them alive. There's a fringe story, you recall, about a Wyoming bunkhouse during the winter of 1886, the infamous Great Die-Up. Temperatures dropped so fast that cattle froze where they stood, upright like statues. Men burned furniture, floorboards, even parts of the roof just to stay warm. They survived, barely, packed into a bunkhouse like sardines, rotating spots near the fire like it was a game of musical chairs with higher stakes. According to legend, one guy refused to give up his warm spot for 3 days straight and got voted out into the snow. He came back later with frostbite and a new attitude. And here's a scholarly debate still chewing on the subject. Were bunkhouses truly practical, or just desperation wrapped in splinters? Some say they were a fire hazard waiting to happen. 12 men, 1 stove, and no exit plan. Others argue that the bunkhouse was a social adaptation to an environmental crisis. The cold was unbeatable alone, but survivable in numbers. You don't sleep in the bunkhouse that night. You take their warmth, their hospitality, silent as it was, and walk back to your own cabin before dusk. Not because you weren't welcome, but because you've grown used to the silence, to the ritual of stoking your own fire and checking your own roof and rolling into your own pile of blankets. Still, you carry something back with you, a shift in how you think. Because this winter survival thing, it's not just about building, it's about sharing, it's about proximity. You can stack walls 10 logs thick and still freeze to death alone. Or you can sleep under a leaking roof with 6 snoring strangers and live to complain about it. You don't have 8 ranch hands to pile into your cabin, but you can take a page from their book. That night you drag your bedding closer to the fire, not just for the heat, but to let the warmth from the stone floor rise into your bones faster. You hang a blanket over the entryway again, this time doubled over for extra insulation. You close off the corners of the room with spare sacks and crates, shrinking the airspace. Less room means less air to warm. You make your cabin smaller, on purpose. And then you sit near the hearth, spooning your own version of bunkhouse beans from a cracked pot, and think about the strange intimacy of shared misery, how winter forces you into other people's orbits. You don't get to be proud when you're half frozen, you just get to be here. Or not. Before you sleep, you tuck a few hot rocks into your bedroll, another tip borrowed from someone smarter, and think about the fire in that bunkhouse, still glowing, still surrounded by snoring, sniffling survivors. A room full of men trying to outlive winter with soup and sarcasm. You're alone tonight, but not lonely. That makes a difference, because now you know what to do if things get worse, where to go, how to build something better than walls, warmth made out of people. You wake before the sun rises, wrapped in your own breath. The fire's burned down to coals again, and the inside of your cabin smells like smoke and slightly scorched beans. But the rocks you tucked into your bedding are still warm, not hot, just a lingering, radiant comfort pressing against your ribs and knees. It's a small victory, but out here, small victories matter. You stretch carefully, feeling the stiffness in your back from sleeping on the uneven floor, and then you sit up slowly. You've got work to do today, less dramatic than chopping logs or outrunning frostbite, but just as critical. Today, you're going underground. You've been thinking about it for a while, turning the idea over in your mind each time the wind screamed against your walls, or your food supply shrank by one more hard biscuit. And now, with the worst of winter still ahead and your supplies wearing thin, it's time to get real about storage and insulation, not in your cabin, beneath it. You step outside, shovel in hand, breath fogging the air like smoke. The cold hits your cheeks and lashes instantly, biting just enough to wake you fully. You head toward the low corner of your cabin, where the snow's thinnest, and start digging. The ground is frozen solid in the top few inches, like trying to chip through iron with a spoon. But you're stubborn. You know the truth. A root cellar, or even just a small dugout chamber, can double as a pantry and a furnace. Not literally, but when built right, it keeps the cold out and the warmth in. More than that, it stores food, which you're going to need soon. Historically, settlers across the West used root cellars to survive not just winter, but spring. The season no one talks about, when supplies run out and the thaw turns everything into mud. Digging into the ground gave them a naturally insulated space to keep vegetables, jars, dry goods, even precious seed for next year's planting. The earth stays around 45 to 55 degrees down there, no matter what kind of blizzard is trying to kill you up top. It's like a hidden hearth under your feet. You dig until the sweat runs down your back and freezes at your waistband, then deeper. Eventually you carve out a space big enough to crouch in, maybe 4 feet deep, with packed sides and a makeshift step. You reinforce the walls with old boards, stones, and whatever scraps you have. It's not elegant. Nothing you've built so far is. But when you crawl inside, it's still, quiet, almost warm. Not the crackling, fire-fed warmth of your hearth, but a dense, stable kind of warmth, like the cold hasn't figured out how to reach this far yet. You sit down on a crate you pulled in and just breathe for a moment, letting the earth surround you. This is the kind of warmth that lasts. The kind you don't have to feed logs to every 3 hours. Doesn't look like much, but it's a kind of miracle, and it's multifunctional. That's what they won't tell you in the history books. Yes, it was food storage. Yes, it was climate control. But for plenty of families, the root cellar was the backup bedroom. When blizzards roared and the cabin walls groaned and the roof threatened to cave in, people would flee underground, just for the night, just until the storm passed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survivable. There's a quirky old account, half journal, half fever dream, from a Missouri homesteader in the 1850s who claimed he spent an entire winter living inside his root cellar after his roof collapsed under snow. Said he shared it with a goat and a barrel of dried apples, called it the best 3 months of his life. The goat was warmer than my ex-wife, he wrote. Take that for what it's worth. You don't have a goat, but you do have a cellar now, and that changes everything. Back in your cabin, you load up what food you have left. Dried beans, hardtack, a jar or two of pickled something, and carry it below. Not much, but enough to make a difference. You stack it carefully on shelves made from firewood scraps, tucking blankets around anything that might freeze. You even set a lantern on a rock outcropping, just in case you need to hunker down one night when the cold gets wild. There's something deeply comforting about knowing you have a space like this, a backup, a plan B. Because surviving winter out here isn't just about toughness, it's about options. The more of those you have, the better your odds. And here's where historians love to argue. Was the root cellar a product of ingenuity or desperation? Some call it brilliant design, an early example of passive climate control and food preservation. Others say it was just a dirt hole, necessary only because people settled in places where nothing else worked. But when you sit down there, surrounded by your supplies, your breath not fogging for once, you stop caring about labels. Desperation or design, either way it's warm, and that's enough. As you climb out, the sky has shifted. The clouds are low again, heavy with more snow. You pack the entrance with boards and a flap of canvas to keep the worst out, then tramp back to your fire. It's already struggling. You feed it a mix of sage and dung and whisper to it like an old friend. Please stay. Please burn. Before bed you boil a pot of water, not for tea but to leave near your bed in a sealed container. Another heat trick. The warm water will radiate overnight, keeping the air just a little less cruel. You're building layers now, not just of blankets but of solutions. Little tricks, subtle advantages, and when you finally lie down, you close your eyes knowing that just a few feet beneath you, there's a cache of food, a shield of earth, and a dark, silent room that winter can't quite reach. You don't know how long this season will last, but tonight, you're better prepared than you were yesterday. And that's the game. One small defense at a time. The cold has started creeping in earlier each evening now. It's not just dropping in after sunset, it's arriving before, sliding down the sky like a shadow with claws. You notice it around your ankles first, the way the air near the floor seems to turn solid, and then it climbs. No matter how high you stack the fire, the cold always finds the floor. Which makes sense. Heat rises, cold settles. And out here, survival often comes down to how well you understand the invisible rules of temperature. You've made your shelter tighter, stronger, warmer. You've got a root cellar stocked with food and fallback options. But there's one more enemy you haven't fully dealt with yet, and it's closer than any snowstorm or frozen stream. It's your own skin. Clothing. The oldest, simplest, and most underestimated form of shelter. You realize it when your boots start to fail, when the left one gets a crack and the snow seeps in, numbing your toes before you even know it's happening. You sit by the fire, peeling off wet socks, cursing softly, and suddenly it hits you. If your clothes quit on you out here, it doesn't matter how many logs you stacked, or how many layers you nailed to your cabin walls. Your shelter begins with your body, and that means it begins with what you put on it. You look at what you're wearing: wool coat, fraying at the cuffs, 2 undershirts, heavy trousers, mismatched socks. All of it working together to keep you from freezing, but none of it quite doing the job alone. That's the truth about winter clothes. They're a team sport. So like everything else out here, you start thinking like a problem solver, like a tinkerer. You need to upgrade. And you start by going back to basics. Historically, frontier folks wore what they had, but the smart ones layered like their lives depended on it, because they did. Cotton was a trap. It got wet and stayed wet, sucking the heat from your bones. Wool, on the other hand, could hold heat even when damp. Not glamorous, not always comfortable, but essential. And fur was gold. Buffalo robes, bear hides, even rabbit pelts, stitched together into vests, mittens, liners. Nothing beat fur for pure, stubborn warmth. You remember hearing that fur trappers used to line their moccasins with rabbit skin, fur side in. Soft, warm, disposable. Swapped out every few days. No sock could compete. And yes, it meant constantly hunting small game or trading with someone who did, but the payoff. Toes that stayed attached through February. And then there's the quirky stuff. Fringe winter fashion that only made sense in a time and place where fashion wasn't a thing. Newspaper tucked into shirts for insulation. Potato sacks turned into makeshift cloaks. Women wore up to 5 skirts at once, using the space between them like insulation layers in a thermos. Men wrapped their legs in strips of blanket tied with raw hide, walking around like slightly panicked mummies. One popular hack? Stuffing dried grass into boots. Didn't last long, but bought you a few hours. You decide to try a few of these. First, you double up your socks, but with a twist. Between them, you wedge a thin layer of dried moss. Soft, insulating, and strangely satisfying to walk on. Then, you grab an old wool blanket and cut it into strips, wrapping them around your legs from the ankles up to your knees. Not elegant, but already warmer. You stitch some spare rabbit fur into your mittens, roughly, messily, and slide them on. The difference is immediate. There's debate among historians about how effective frontier clothing really was. Some say the settlers came west woefully unprepared, bringing eastern fashions and too thin layers, then panicking when the cold hit. Others argue that frontier people were constantly adapting, improvising on the fly, trading with indigenous people, stealing techniques and materials wherever they could. The truth is probably both. A lot of toes were lost before people got smart. And speaking of smart, indigenous winter wear was leagues ahead of anything most settlers brought with them. Deerskin clothing sewn with sinew, layered with fur, snowproof, wind-resistant, and often custom fit. Some nations used porcupine quills to reinforce seams, or designed their boots with turned-up toes to walk easier through drifts. Every detail mattered, every stitch earned. You try to mimic that in your own way. You take an old pair of pants and sew a lining of scrap wool inside. You add a second collar to your coat, just a flap of rabbit hide, and feel the difference when the wind brushes past. Then, in a stroke of curiosity, you line your hat with buffalo fur you traded for last season. and suddenly understand why everyone used to walk around looking like they were smuggling raccoons on their heads. The heat it traps is unreal. You even fashion a hood out of an old flour sack, lining it with moss and tying it tight beneath your chin. You look ridiculous. But you feel invincible, and in a blizzard, dignity doesn't matter. Warmth does. That night, you test your new gear by sitting outside for longer than usual. The snow is falling again, soft, steady, and your boots crunch gently as you move through it, wrapped in layers like a walking quilt. You sit on a stump and just breathe. For once, your fingers aren't numb. Your breath still fogs the air, but it doesn't feel like your lungs are turning to ice. You glance up. The stars are buried behind clouds, but the sky still glows faintly. Everything is quiet, even the trees. And you think to yourself, this is what shelter really means. Not just a roof, not just fire, but armour. Smart, hand-stitched, slightly lopsided armour against the longer season. You return to your cabin eventually, shedding the outer layers carefully, like peeling an onion made of wool and fur and moss. You hang your mittens near the fire, your boots by the door, and climb into your bedding with the heat of motion still clinging to your skin. And as you lie there, you think of all the things you've learned to wear, not just the fabric and fur, but the awareness, the readiness, the knowledge that out here staying warm isn't a luxury, it's a daily decision. And the cold is always waiting for you to forget that. But tonight you haven't. You wake to smoke. Not the gentle wood smoke you've come to associate with comfort and life and relative safety, but the kind that stings your nose before your eyes even open. Thick, cloying, immediate. You bolt upright in your blankets, coughing, eyes streaming, and scramble toward the door with your heart thundering in your chest. Panic comes in fast and sharp, because in the Wild West, a fire inside your shelter isn't just dangerous, it's fatal. You throw open the door and freezing air rushes in like a slap to the face, clearing your head just enough to think. Not flames, not yet, just smoke. Lots of it, curling down from the ceiling, pouring from the hearth like the chimney's quit its job. You grab a stick and poke the embers, coughing and cursing, trying to figure out where the airflow went. Did the flue freeze? Did snow clog the vent? Did the wind flip directions and start backdrafting into your cabin? Yes? Maybe. Probably. You throw on your coat and stomp outside, boots crunching through new snow, and sure enough, you find the source. The top of your chimney, such as it is, has iced over. A heavy slab of frozen sleet and crusted snow sealed it like a cork. No smoke's getting out, which means all of it is staying in. And now you know, chimneys aren't optional luxuries. They're not quaint details or architectural flourishes. They're your shelter's lungs. If they stop working, everything else stops too. You clear the ice with the blunt end of a hatchet, watching it shatter and fall in chunks, and within minutes the smoke inside your cabin begins to rise again, following the proper path up and out. You head back inside, eyes watering, and open the door wide to let the last of the haze escape. Your fire sputters, confused but relieved, and you sit down on your bunk exhausted and soot-streaked, realizing you've just survived another one of winter's little games. Now you start thinking seriously about your chimney. Until now you'd been improvising. Holes in the roof, smoke flaps, gaps between logs. It worked, sort of. But winter is getting meaner. The fires are burning longer, hotter, and now the air inside's getting heavy with soot. You've noticed it. The black smudges on your ceiling beams, the way your coat always smells like a campfire that's overstayed its welcome. Time to upgrade. Historically, early settlers tried just about everything to build chimneys on the frontier. Brick? Rare. Too heavy to transport, too hard to make without a proper kiln. Stone? Better, if you had time, and access to a quarry. Most often they used mud and sticks. That's right, wattle and daub chimneys. You build a framework from saplings or old boards, plaster it with a mix of clay, sand and straw, then let it dry and hope it doesn't crumble when the fire gets too hot. You remember one old frontier manual that warned readers, do not trust a greenwood chimney, lest it dry and burn you out before breakfast. A fair warning, and yet people did it anyway, because they had to. There's a quirky tale from a Nebraska homesteader who built his first chimney from sod and scrap iron. Said it worked like a charm until the neighbour's cow leaned against it during a storm and collapsed the whole thing. The house filled with smoke, the cow fled, and he never built another chimney without rocks again. You go outside and start collecting stone, slowly, carefully. It's miserable work in the cold, your gloves stiffen, Your fingers go numb, but it's worth it. You build a low, square base around your existing fire pit using the biggest stones you can carry. Then you stack upward, adding mortar where you can, which is just mud mixed with leftover ash and straw, and reinforcing gaps with bits of scrap metal you'd plan to use for other things. Not elegant, not pretty, but stronger than the hole in your roof. You also carve out a better draft channel. That's something most folks forget. A good chimney doesn't just send smoke up, it pulls cold air in and hot air out, creating a flow that keeps the fire breathing. You dig a small trench under the hearth for airflow, place a pipe scavenged from an old stovepipe at the base, and watch as your fire roars back to life like you just handed it lungs. That night the difference is immediate. The air in the cabin is clearer. The smoke goes where it's supposed to. Your fire burns hotter, cleaner and brighter. You sit in its glow, watching the flames curl upward into your newly reinforced chimney and feel something close to pride. Of course, it's not foolproof. Chimneys in the West failed all the time. They cracked in the cold, collapsed under snow, or caught fire when the daub dried out and caught a stray ember. Fires were so common that many cabins had escape hatches built into their roofs, holes covered with animal hide just big enough to crawl through. Others had none, and those stories rarely had happy endings. You hear one in your head now, a grim little anecdote passed down from a trapper-turned-preacher who claimed he lost his winter cabin to a chimney spark in 1871. Said he watched the roof catch fire from his own bed, and by the time he got out the whole thing was gone. "The Lord spared me," he said, "but not my biscuits." You double-check your fire before bed, you place a kettle near the hearth, partly for heat, partly as a fail-safe. If it whistles in the night, you'll know the fire got too high. You stack an extra layer of stones around the base of your chimney, just in case. Then you crawl into your bedding, blanket pulled tight, eyes scanning the ceiling. Smoke stains, blackened beams, a faint persistent smell of pine and ash. This is life now, but at least the smoke is going up, not in, and as you drift off, muscles aching, eyes still a little raw from the morning scare, you realise this is what most people never understood about frontier survival. Comfort wasn't the goal. Control was, even just a little. A chimney that draws right, a fire that burns clean, air you can breathe. Those are the luxuries, and they're earned. Tomorrow you'll patch more cracks, maybe add a stone cap to keep snow out, but tonight you're not choking on your own fire. That's progress. The roof groans, not creaks, groans. A long, slow, aching sound, like the bones of your cabin are waking up sore from the weight of the night. You're already awake, lying on your back and staring at the dark planks above you, heart quietly thumping as each sound echoes a little louder than it should. You know that sound. It's not wind, not animals, it's snow, a lot of it, heavy, wet, and settling hard. Which means you've got a new problem. Because no matter how well you've sealed your walls or managed your fire, if your roof gives in, you're done. You throw on your coat and boots, grab a stick you've been using to tend the fire and poke the ceiling beams. They hold, for now. But you can feel the pressure, hear it. That dense weight pressing down from above, one cold flake at a time. You step outside, boots crunching through powder that's reached mid-thigh, and look up. The roof is sagging under a fresh foot of snow. Thick, sticky stuff. Not the light, fluffy kind that drifts like ash, but the mean, wet snow that sticks to everything and packs like wet cement. It's beautiful in a cruel sort of way. The trees look like sculptures. The sky is slate grey. But all you can think is, I need to get that snow off before the whole place caves in. You grab a shovel and climb onto a stump to reach the low edge. Then you start pulling, heaving great white slabs off the roof, sending them sliding down in waves. Each time you clear a patch, the roof groans a little less. Each time your arms burn a little more. It's brutal work, but it has to be done. Because if snow piles up too high, it doesn't just add weight. It freezes, melts a little, refreezes, and turns into a slab of ice. One that can snap beams, crush rafters, and turn your cabin into a coffin in the middle of the night. Historically, this happened all the time. Early settlers often underestimated how much snow could fall, and how heavy it could get. They built with flat roofs because it was easier, faster, or they just didn't know better. But a flat roof in the West was an invitation to disaster. The smart ones started building with steep pitches, roofs that shed snow like a dog shakes off water. Others added poles that jutted from the eaves, letting them yank snow down with ropes from the safety of the ground. You wish you'd thought of that earlier. There's a grim little story from the Idaho Territory about a couple who built their first cabin with a flat sod roof. After a week of steady snowfall, it collapsed while they were sleeping. The wife survived by digging her way out with a spoon. The husband didn't. His name was found carved into the inside wall of the root cellar, scratched there sometime before the final collapse. You think about that story every time your roof groans now. It's not paranoia, it's memory. Your own cabin was never meant to last forever. The roof is a patchwork of bark, branches, and snow-packed moss. You reinforced it with poles weeks ago, but those were stopgaps, temporary fixes. You hadn't counted on this much snow, this early, this heavy. No one ever does. You climb onto a crate to reach the higher edge and start clearing again. The snow slides off in sheets, crashing to the ground and scattering over your boots. Your hands go numb inside your gloves, and your breath rasps in your chest. It takes nearly an hour, but eventually the worst of it is gone. You hop down, soaked in sweat despite the cold, and glance upward. The roof still holds. But you know this won't be the last time you have to do this. Back inside, you stoke the fire and peel off your wet gloves. Your fingers are red and stiff, but they still work. That's all that matters. You start thinking about solutions, real ones. You need a slanted roof, steep enough to keep snow from sticking, strong enough to hold what does. That means more logs, angled supports, and probably taking apart half of what you've already built, which means exposure, risk, time. Or maybe you adapt like some homesteaders did and build an interior brace system, posts wedged from floor to ceiling to keep the beams from buckling. Ugly, but effective. You decide to try that first. You cut a few poles to length, shave them flat at the ends and jam them under the worst of the sagging beams. You wedge them tight, listening for any protest from the structure, and when there's none, you exhale. Even a temporary solution is better than waiting for the roof to flatten you. Some historians argue that roof failure was one of the most common causes of winter death. Not fire, not starvation, not frostbite, but bad design. Especially in places where snow came hard and fast. It wasn't just about sheltering from wind, it was about engineering against a silent, accumulating threat. People didn't just build homes, they learned to calculate weight, angle, drainage. They learned the hard way. There's a strange comfort in knowing that. You're not the only one to wrestle with snow loads and sagging beams. You're just next in line. And out on the frontier, knowledge was currency. People traded roof designs like recipes. Add another brace under the west corner. Pitch it toward the river so the runoff doesn't freeze your door shut. Use bark with the grain, or it peels and traps ice. Tips passed from one survivor to another. No manuals needed. You decide you'll make your own change tomorrow. Raise the angle with some angled crossbeams if you can find the right trees. In the meantime, you check the roof every few hours, clearing new snow as it falls. Your shoulders ache, your back's a question mark, but your ceiling holds. That night, as the wind picks up again and the snow starts falling in its lazy, silent way, you lie in bed listening, waiting. The groan is still there, faint, but it no longer sounds like a warning. It sounds like endurance. The roof may not be perfect, but it's standing, and so are you. There's a sound you don't hear often, not way out here, not this deep into winter, and when you do, it freezes the blood in your veins faster than any blizzard ever could. It's the low, deliberate crunch of something heavy moving across snow, not wind, not deer, something slower, smarter, closer. You're standing near your cabin, arms full of firewood, when it happens. Just a single crunch behind you, then nothing. You turn slowly, heart ticking like a drum, and scan the tree line. Everything's still. Too still. The wind is quiet today. The snow falls gently, flakes big and lazy like they're not in a hurry to get anywhere. And that silence makes it worse. You set the wood down gently. Your hatchet is still tucked in your belt, and now your hand is on it. Crunch. This time, it's to your left. Closer. You turn your head just enough to catch a shape. Low, long, grey. Eyes level with yours, but unblinking. It's a wolf. Full grown. Maybe 24 paces away. No snarl. No sudden movement. Just watching. Assessing. You don't run. You don't even blink. Running is prey behaviour. You know better. Wolves aren't your enemies, most of the time. But winter does strange things to hunger. Out here, starvation makes the rules. And if the pack's nearby, this one might be testing you. You've heard the stories. Packs that trailed lonely trappers for days, waiting for frostbite or injury or a fire that burned too low. Stories where the wolves were quiet and patient and only struck when they were sure they'd win. So you stare back, fingers tightening on your hatchet. You lower your stance slightly, not threatening, just grounded, ready. And then the wolf blinks, looks away, turns. Another shape appears behind it, farther off, then a third. But they don't come closer. The first one glances over its shoulder once, like it's making a decision, and then the group melts back into the trees. You exhale like you've been holding your breath for an hour, and now, finally, your knees start to shake. Predators. You built this shelter to fight off cold, snow, and loneliness. But now, as you stack the wood inside and bar the door for the night, you're reminded of something people in the West always knew, but often forgot until it was too late. Winter brings company. Wolves, coyotes, mountain lions, even desperate bears if the freeze doesn't come fast enough. They don't knock, they don't roar, they just show up. And if your shelter isn't ready, they'll test it, scratch at the door, circle in the dark, look for weaknesses. You pull out the extra boards you've been saving for emergencies and begin reinforcing the cabin. Not because you expect a siege, but because now your brain won't let you sleep otherwise. You board up the lower window, just a hole covered in hide and wishful thinking. You add a crossbar to the door, and then you scatter ashes around the perimeter, an old trick to spot fresh tracks. If something circles in the night, you'll know by morning. It's not just paranoia, it's preparation. There are old journals full of similar stories. Trappers who were dragged out of tents. Families who lost livestock because they thought their barn was secure. One legendary tale from northern Colorado tells of a woman who woke to find 3 wolves in her sod house, having slipped through a loose corner while she slept. She fought them off with a ladle, survived, named her next child Grey. Whether the story's true doesn't even matter. People believed it, because out here it could have happened. Some scholars debate whether wolves really posed a significant threat to humans during Western expansion. The records are spotty. For every confirmed attack, there are dozens of myths, cautionary tales, or drunken exaggerations. Most wolves avoided humans, especially groups, but lone travellers, isolated cabins, a dying animal, those were tempting targets, and desperation skews behaviour. So you don't take chances. That night you sleep light, hatchet within reach, one ear tuned to every crack and creak, but nothing comes. Still, when you step outside the next morning, there they are. Tracks. Fresh ones. A half circle around the cabin. Close. Measured. Like a curious ghost walked the perimeter and took notes. Your mouth goes dry. Not fear this time. Something more like awareness. You're not alone out here. Not by a long shot. You never were. The woods are full of things just smart enough to know how weak you are at the edge of winter. You consider baiting a snare. You've seen how the locals do it. Dig a shallow pit, cover it in snow-dusted brush, lay a scrap of meat. A crude trick, but sometimes effective. Or maybe just set warning bells on a trip line across the front of the cabin, a heads up if anything starts sniffing too close. You've never built one, but suddenly it feels like a skill worth learning. You also sharpen your tools. The hatchet, a long knife, a piece of metal you hammer into a crude spear point. It's all theatre maybe, but theatre helps you sleep. Because no one writes about this in the building guides. The predators. Everyone talks about weatherproofing, not wolf-proofing. About how to stop the cold from coming in, but not how to keep teeth out. Yet this was part of winter survival too. Especially for ranch hands guarding livestock or settlers who built their homes near migration trails. Fences were only half the battle. The other half came at night, quiet and padded and hungry. That evening you watched the tree line from your doorway. No movement, no eyes glinting in the dusk. Just trees, just snow, just the kind of stillness that might be nothing, or might be something watching. Inside you double-check the door again. The bar holds, the fire is strong, your tools are near, and your heart, finally, begins to slow. Because if winter is a siege, it's not just cold battering your walls, it's hunger. Yours, theirs, everyone's. And survival means knowing which sounds to ignore, and which ones mean something's coming. You start to realize the wind is the real villain of this whole operation. Not the snow, not the wolves, not even the cold. The wind. It's invisible, unpredictable, and personal. It's the thing that strips the heat from your fire before it can reach your fingers, that slips between your layers no matter how many you're wearing, that howls through your chinks at night like it's laughing at you. And worst of all, it changes. One minute it's a soft whisper coming from the south, and the next it's barreling in from the north like a freight train made of ice and regret. You're halfway through fixing the hinge on your makeshift door when the first gust punches the side of your cabin. Not a gentle knock, an open-palmed slap. You freeze, tool in hand, and feel the entire structure shudder. That's when you know another storm's on the way. Not snow, not this time. Wind. The kind that finds the weakest part of your shelter and focuses all its wrath right there. You brace the door with an extra beam and start pacing the inside perimeter like a general inspecting the defences. You press your hand to the walls, checking for leaks. You crouch near the floor, feel for drafts. There, back corner. Just a thin stream of air pushing through like a needle through fabric, but enough to turn your entire corner into an icebox if it keeps going. You pack it with moss, then with a bit of mud mixed with ash. Your go-to emergency sealant. You add a blanket over it for good measure, then you start on the roof. Wind doesn't just blow snow around, it lifts it, hurls it, rips it from trees and drops it into drifts taller than your waist. It also tests every joint in your roof, looking for a weak spot, and if it finds one, it tears at it until the snow pours in, followed by cold, followed by misery. Historically, Western settlers were slow to learn this. They thought walls would save them. They thought a fire could beat the weather, but they underestimated the wind. It wasn't until enough cabins blew apart, or filled with snow from above, that they began designing structures with wind in mind. Angled roofs, windbreaks, snow fencing, low profiles, cabins half sunk into the earth so the wind had less to attack. And those weren't luxury upgrades. They were essential in open country where the land stretched flat for miles and nothing broke the gusts but your stubborn little box of logs. You grab an old tarp, some nails, and a hammer with a cracked handle. Climb onto the roof. The snow is slick beneath your boots, and the wind has already started picking up, threading through the trees with that eerie rising whistle. You spread the tarp over the weak spots, drive nails into the beams where you can, and lash the rest down with rope. It won't last forever, but it might last tonight. Then you do something new, something you hadn't thought to do until now. You build a windbreak, out of old logs, branches, anything you can scavenge. Just a rough wall, maybe 3 feet high, stacked along the windward side of the cabin. It's crude, ugly, but it does its job. You can feel the difference instantly. The wind hits the break, rushes up and over instead of slamming straight into your wall. The pressure eases, the howling lessens. It's a tactic as old as the land. Indigenous peoples built wind shelters with snow and brush. Trappers stacked hides against their tents. Homesteaders planted rows of trees. Windrows, they called them. But that only worked if you had 10 years to wait and the trees didn't die first. There's a strange little story you remember from a wintering camp in the Badlands. A man who'd been a sailor before heading west claimed he survived his first Dakota winter by thinking like he was still on a ship. He built windbreaks like bulkheads, used rope to secure his shelter like rigging, even made a makeshift anchor stone to keep his door from flying open during storms. People laughed at him, until his was the only cabin still standing come spring. The scholars? Oh, they debate it. Some say the wind wasn't as much of a factor as the temperature drop. Others argue that wind chill killed more people than cold ever did, and it just didn't make it into the record because frostbite isn't good at leaving paperwork. But those who lived through it, they didn't need convincing. You talk to any old-timer and they'll tell you, it wasn't the snow that got you, it was the wind. Back inside, you feel the difference almost immediately. The fire seems to warm the room faster now. The cold doesn't wrap around your legs like before. There's still a draft here and there, but it's more manageable, less aggressive. Like you've finally convinced the air to fight fair. You sit by the hearth with your coat still on, not because you need it, but because it feels good to keep it close. The wind slaps the outside wall again, but this time it's muffled, distant, like it's been demoted from tyrant to nuisance. And that's how winter works. It never really gives up. You just find ways to mute it, redirect it, trick it into passing you by. You look at your patched roof, your crude windbreak, the blanket draped over the worst of the corner leaks. None of it's pretty. None of it's what you imagined when you thought of frontier life. But it works. And more than that, it teaches. Because wind is a teacher, a harsh one. And if you don't listen, it'll come back louder. That night, the storm arrives. You hear it sweep in like a tidal wave of sound, roaring through the forest, bending trees, scraping across your roof with fingers of ice. But your cabin holds. The windbreak holds. You sit in the glow of the fire, listening warm for now, and you smile, just a little. Not because you've won. No one wins against the wind. But because tonight, it has to work a little harder. You didn't think you'd miss people. Not really. Not out here. Solitude was supposed to be part of the appeal. The silence, the stillness, the freedom to do everything your own way. And for a while, that worked. For weeks, it was just you, your cabin, the trees, and the wind. No neighbours, no expectations, no noise. But winter has a way of stripping things down to their essentials. And as the snow deepens and the nights stretch longer than your nerves can handle, the silence stops feeling like peace and starts feeling like pressure. You spend a few days like that, working through your firewood pile in silence, cooking in silence, eating in silence, and then sitting by the fire with no one to talk to but yourself. And at first, you don't mind. But slowly you start noticing the absence. You catch yourself talking aloud when you knock over a pot or when the fire goes out early. You laugh at a joke in your head, then realise no one else is laughing. You find yourself listening harder to the wind, like it might be trying to speak. So when you see smoke rising from the valley one morning, your first thought isn't fear, it's hope. You climb a nearby ridge, careful on the ice, and scan the horizon. There it is, a thin thread of grey smoke curling up through the trees, maybe half a mile east. A campfire, or maybe a chimney. Someone else is out here. You head back to your cabin, pack a small bag, just some jerky, a flask of hot water, a knife you've sharpened 3 times more than it probably needs, and set out. Not to intrude, not to ask for anything, just to confirm, just to see. You tell yourself it's about safety. If something goes wrong, it's good to know where others are. But really it's curiosity, and maybe, just a little, it's loneliness. As you hike, the snow crunches beneath your boots, and the wind cuts across your cheeks. But something about the journey feels lighter than usual. Your legs don't ache the same way. Your thoughts don't circle the same tracks. You're focused outward, finally. You reach the cabin by mid-afternoon. Smaller than yours, simpler, smoke trickling out through a crooked stovepipe, snow piled high along the base. You call out, softly at first, then louder. A shape moves behind the curtain in the tiny window. A second later, the door opens. They're about your age, rough-looking, tired eyes, but they smile. Just a flicker, just enough. You talk. You don't even remember the first words, something about the snow or the smoke or your ridiculous layered clothing. But suddenly the fire inside their cabin is crackling, and you're sharing warmth and stories. You trade some of your rabbit jerky for a piece of dry bread they salvaged from a broken crate. You both agree it tastes like sawdust, but it's the best sawdust you've had in weeks. And just like that, the cold feels manageable again. This is how communities began out here. Not in churches or town halls, but in bunkhouses, cabins, even snow shelters, anywhere people huddled together long enough to share warmth. Homesteaders would build within sight of each other's smoke trails, sometimes within shouting distance. Not because they wanted neighbours, but because they needed them. You could go a whole winter without speaking, but knowing someone was close by. That was insurance. There's a story from the Wyoming frontier about a family who lost their fire during a 3-day whiteout. They were half frozen when a neighbour spotted the absence of smoke and dug his way to their cabin through snowdrifts higher than the roof. He brought fire in a bucket, literally carried embers across half a mile. That's what passed for heroism out here, heat. Some historians debate whether isolation or exposure killed more settlers in the West. The records are fuzzy. Weather is easier to document than mental collapse. But there are endless journal entries about the silence, about the voices people started hearing in the wind, about how even the strongest pioneers cracked under too many nights alone. That's why you stay longer than you meant to. Hours pass and the conversation flows, awkward at first, then natural. You both laugh at the same dumb story about a frozen boot. They tell you they once burned the soles off their shoes by putting them too close to the fire. You admit you nearly suffocated yourself 2 weeks ago when your chimney iced shut. And just like that, you're not strangers anymore. Before you leave, they hand you a piece of paper, a crude map showing the shortcut trail between your cabins, in case you ever need to make the trip faster. You tuck it into your coat like it's made of gold. You make it back just before nightfall. The wind has picked up again, and the trees are groaning under the snow's weight. But you don't care. You light your fire, hang your coat, and for the first time in weeks you don't feel buried by the walls, because now you know someone else is out there. Someone real. You dig out a spare tin and set it aside. Tomorrow you'll make stew and take them some. Not for trade, not for obligation, just because that's how it works out here. One warm meal at a time, and as you lie down in your bed staring up at the ceiling like always, something new settles over you. Not silence, but connection. Not comfort exactly, but something close. Out here, survival isn't just about fire and walls, it's about knowing who might answer if you call. The wind shifts overnight, and by morning the world has changed. You wake to a silence so heavy it makes your ears ring. No creaks from the roof, no rustle in the trees, no breath of wind brushing past the cabin's seams, just stillness and cold, a deeper kind of cold. The kind that comes not with blizzards or storms, but with quiet and clarity. You already know what that means. You open the door and the air punches into your lungs like you inhaled a blade. The sky is perfectly blue, cloudless, brittle. The snow doesn't glisten. It stares back at you, flat and sun-blind. Every sound is louder. The crunch of your boots, the crack of a tree splitting under stress, the groan of the world just trying to hold itself together. This is it. The real winter. The one that separates cold from cold enough to kill you in your sleep. And you've heard stories about this particular one. The Great Winter of '88. January mostly. Northern Plains. The cold came down like a hammer and didn't lift for weeks. No warning, just a snap. And folks who were already barely hanging on found themselves buried. Sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. Back then, ranchers across Montana and the Dakotas watched helplessly as their herds froze where they stood. No time to get them to shelter. No food, just ice. Cattle froze mid-step, still chewing. Horses lay down and didn't get up. Some drifted into ravines trying to escape the wind and got buried alive when the snow filled in behind them. Ranchers lost everything. Some packed up and went back east. Others stayed, poorer and meaner than before. You weren't alive for that winter, obviously, but its ghost lingers in every precaution you take. The reinforced roof, the extra wood pile, the root cellar now double-lined with blankets and straw. You even cleared the path to your neighbour's cabin yesterday, just in case, and now, standing in the blue stillness of this new, crueler morning, you're grateful for every paranoid choice you've made. Because this kind of cold doesn't knock, it just walks in. You check the fire, it's low but holding. You toss in a buffalo chip and a few sticks of dry wood and crouch close. The heat barely reaches you. It's like the cold is pressing against the flames themselves, trying to convince them to quit. There's a layer of ice forming on the inside of your cabin walls now. Not frost. Ice. Your breath hits the air and just drops, heavy and slow, like steam in a freezer. You move faster today, because stillness is dangerous. You wrap a scarf over your mouth and nose to keep your breath from freezing inside your lungs. That's not dramatic. That's real. You once read about a man who passed out during a similar freeze after taking one deep breath of -60 air. Didn't die, but he never spoke quite the same again. And here's where things start to get weird. Because during these historic cold snaps, the world behaves differently. Sound travels farther, trees explode, literally, when the sap inside them freezes and expands with nowhere to go. You hear one such pop in the woods this morning, and even though you know what it is, it still makes you jump. This cold doesn't care how many walls you've built or how good your coat is. It finds the gaps, always. It comes up through the floor, down through the roof, in through the seams of your mittens. The only real defense is movement and vigilance. You decide to check on your neighbor, the one you met last week. You pull on every layer you have. Double socks, fur-lined coat, scarf, mittens. You tuck hot rocks into your coat pocket to press against your ribs. Then you step into the cold. The air steals the breath from you instantly. Your eyes water. The tears freeze. It takes 20 minutes to get there, even though it's only a half-mile. You lose feeling in your toes halfway through. By the time you arrive, your scarf is stiff with frost. You knock, harder than you need to. The door opens a crack, eyes peer through wide and red. "Just checkin', you say?" They nod. That's all you need. You trade a few supplies, A bit of jerky for half a dried onion. No one's pretending to be generous. It's just math. They say their fire's low. You suggest pulling the bedding into the root cellar, maybe sealing it tight for the night. It's good advice. Might even save their life. On your way back, you catch yourself whispering under your breath. Not a prayer exactly. More like a negotiation with the sky. Let the fire hold. Let the roof hold. Just one more night like this, and then maybe it'll break. There's a scholarly debate, has been for decades, about whether the Great Winter of 1888 was the worst on record. Some point to 1886, others to the brutal snowfalls of 1936. But the journals from 1888 tell a different kind of story. Less about totals, more about weariness. You can read it in the writing, sentences that taper off, half-finished entries, pages stained by the fire or tears or both. It was a winter that didn't just freeze bodies, it froze hope. Back in your cabin, you seal everything again. You add more stones to the fire pit, pile blankets around the edges of your bedding, crawl in wearing most of your clothing, and lie still. You can hear your heartbeat louder than the wind. That night the sky is clear. The temperature drops even further, colder than it's been all year. The fire crackles steadily, but its heat barely fills the room. You hold your hands close, rub your feet together inside your boots and count every flicker of the flame like it's a countdown. This isn't the kind of night where you drift off. This is the kind of night where you doze, then snap awake to check the fire. Then again, and again. You sleep like a watchman, half-brained and alert, ready to jump up the moment the fire dims or the wind gets clever. And through it all you survive. When morning comes, your beard is rimmed with frost and your water jug is frozen solid, but your fire is still alive. And so are you. You're not sure when it started, maybe during the cold snap or sometime in the days after, but your cabin's gotten quieter, not just from the snow muffling the world outside. No, something in the walls has changed. You listen for it now and you can feel it more than hear it, the difference between a space that holds warmth and one that just happens to contain it. That's when it clicks. Insulation. Real insulation. Up to this point you've survived by brute force. Fire, fur, layers, hot rocks. But the warmth you've been chasing keeps slipping out between the logs, floating into the night like your breath. You've sealed gaps with moss and mud, stuffed rags into corners, even hung blankets like drapes. But now you're thinking bigger, smarter, like the settlers who stayed out here long term and learned how to trap heat the way they trapped rabbits, with patience and cleverness. You start studying your cabin differently. The walls, yes, but also the floor, the ceiling, the joints. Where does the warmth go? And how do you keep it? You remember reading somewhere that in early homesteads people used whatever they had, sawdust, straw, newspaper, even ashes, to fill the spaces between walls. It wasn't about perfection. It was about plugging every hole until the cabin felt less like a wooden sieve and more like a sealed jar of soup. So you get to work. First the walls. You've got an old stack of newspapers you used to line a crate. Not much, but they'll do. You roll and wedge them into the wider cracks, where mud chinking has started to dry and crumble. You find an old flour sack, shred it into strips, and stuff it into the thin vertical seams between logs. Then you add more moss over top, double layered. Ugly as sin, but efficient. Next, the ceiling. It's never been properly sealed, just rough-hewn boards with a few branches tossed over the top. The snow helps insulate, sure, but not enough. You take old burlap sacks and nail them up between the rafters, creating a kind of drop ceiling effect. Between the burlap and the roof, you pack straw and leaves you stored back in autumn. The room gets darker immediately. The warmth stays longer. The floor is the real problem. Cold seeps up from the dirt like regret. You don't have floorboards, just packed earth, but you can work with that. You lay down spruce boughs first, then a layer of flattened hide, then your bedroll. It's not furniture store luxury, but it creates enough of a barrier that your bones don't feel like they're lying on a frozen river anymore. There's a frontier story about a man who insulated his entire shack with rabbit skins, hundreds of them, nailed like shingles across the walls, claimed he could sit in there in his undershirt while snow piled waist-high outside. Probably an exaggeration, but there's something to the idea. Insulation isn't just a material, it's a mindset. Whatever you've got, use it. Some settlers lined their cabins with mud and horsehair. Others used sawdust mixed with ash and soot, which supposedly discouraged bugs. Some even nailed up old quilts. One layer to trap the warmth, the next to make the place feel like home. Because when the nights get long and the cold keeps pressing against your back, it matters if your walls feel like protection or just an illusion. And here's where historians love to argue. Did frontier folks actually understand thermal insulation, or did they just throw junk at the walls and hope for the best? Some say they were improvising out of desperation. Others believe they were incredibly adaptive, learning through observation, trial, and shared knowledge. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. You fall into that same learning curve now. After hours of sealing, packing, and patching, you sit by the fire and feel it. The difference. The air around you doesn't cool off as fast when the flames die low. You're not chasing warmth anymore, it lingers, it holds, like your cabin has finally agreed to do its part. To test it, you let the fire go out for the first time in days, on purpose, just for a little while. You wrap up in your blankets and lie still, eyes closed, listening, waiting. You expect the chill to creep in fast, but it doesn't. Minutes pass, then longer. The warmth remains, subtle but real. You've bought yourself time, and in winter, time is everything. You relight the fire eventually just because you can, and when you do, the warmth builds faster, climbs higher, spreads deeper. Because it's not escaping anymore. You've stopped the leaks, or at least slowed them down enough to matter. That night, you sleep deeper than you have in weeks. You wake up only once to adjust a blanket. No frozen nose, no stiff fingers, no coughing from smoke that won't rise. Just quiet. And a slow, steady pulse of warmth around you like a second skin. The insulation isn't glamorous. You can't see it and feel proud the way you do with a new tool or a stack of chopped wood. But it works. It's what separates the people who made it through the winter from those who didn't. It's what turned a pile of logs into a home. In the morning you go outside and check the roof. The snow is thick, the sky is clear, but when you come back in, the warmth hits you like a handshake. You built this, one patch at a time. You've been carrying fire from the beginning. It's the one thing you tend like it's alive, because out here it is. It's your cook, your doctor, your night watchman, your heat. Without it, everything collapses fast, and the way you treat fire, it changes. At first, it's just a thing you light and feed and hope doesn't go out. But the deeper winter gets, the more the fire becomes a ritual, a relationship. You learn its moods. You start reading the way it burns, the way it crackles, the sound it makes when the wood's too green or the air's too wet. And you learn its tricks. Because not every fire has to come from a full stack of logs. Sometimes you don't have the energy to split wood, or the time to wait for a flame to catch. Sometimes you're too cold to be patient. That's when you start using the little hacks, the heating tricks you never would have imagined back when your hands still had feeling, and you thought a warm room came from walls alone. The first trick is one you already know now: hot rocks. You've been doing it in small ways, heating stones near the fire, tucking them into your bedding, but you start getting strategic about it. You rotate them, set up a rock circle around the fire so you've always got some heating while others charge. Big, dense rocks hold heat longer. Soapstone, if you can find it, stays warm for hours. You wrap the stones in cloth and drop them into the foot of your bedding before you sleep. No frozen toes. Next up, ember pots. You fashion one from an old tin coffee can, punching holes in the sides near the bottom. You scoop embers into it when you leave your cabin, nestle it in a pile of ashes, and cover the top with a flat stone or a chunk of scrap iron. It's a portable heater, more or less. It won't light a room, but it'll keep a small space warm enough to keep you from shivering to death. The same trick was used by cowboys sleeping out on the trail, carrying coals in metal pots, wrapping them in wet burlap to keep them smouldering, then using them to relight fires at the next camp. You test it one evening in your root cellar. Bring the ember pot down, let it warm the tight space while you sort through your dwindling food supply. It works better than you expected. The air down there doesn't bite. You could sit for hours. You might need to, eventually. Then there's the bed warming bottle, another borrowed trick from back east. You take a tin flask, fill it with boiling water, seal it tight, and tuck it between your layers before bed. You're not sure why it took you this long to try it. It works like a charm. Settlers use stoneware jugs or even thick glass bottles wrapped in socks. You don't have either, but your flask does the job. There are fringe stories of even stranger fire hacks. One tale tells of a man in Colorado who used a hollowed-out log filled with ashes and coals, sealed on both ends and slung under his wagon like a stove on wheels. Used it to heat a rolling bunk during winter treks. Another claimed his grandmother survived a winter by heating bricks in her oven every evening. stacking them in a basket beside the bed and rotating them through the night like a one-woman train schedule. People got creative. When survival is on the line, you stop caring if something looks ridiculous. You care if it works. You start testing every trick you've heard of. You hang a pot of water above the fire, not to cook, just to humidify the air. Dry heat cracks your skin and splits your lips, but moist air holds warmth better. Settlers would hang wet cloths or even steam snow to keep cabins from drying out. You notice it helps you breathe easier, especially at night. Then you experiment with heat reflection. You prop up an old sheet of metal behind the fire, angled just so. The heat bounces off and spreads deeper into the room. You remember reading how some cabins were built with whitewashed walls for the same reason. More reflection, more warmth. You tack up a scrap of white canvas behind your fire pit and swear the room gets warmer faster. You think about how much time you've spent gathering fuel, days and days of chopping, hauling, drying, and realise how much energy these hacks save. A few well-placed stones, a properly sealed window, and a hot water bottle do more than a stack of half-burned logs sometimes. It's not about how much you burn, it's about how you hold on to the heat. And the longer you survive out here, the more you appreciate how fire becomes something beyond utility. It's a companion, not romantic, but steady. The fire doesn't ask questions, doesn't judge, it's just there. If you feed it, if you respect it, and if you're careless, it turns on you without mercy. You've seen that too. There's a scholarly argument about whether these fire hacks were widespread or just lucky anomalies passed down in family stories. Some claim people clung to routine, logs, smoke, repeat, and didn't innovate much. Others say the frontier was a hotbed of trial and error, where necessity bred constant invention. But honestly, you don't care which camp wins. You care that your rocks are still warm in the morning and your breath isn't fogging up inside your blanket. And the biggest trick of all, you learn to let the fire go low when it doesn't need to be high. That's a shift in mindset. In the beginning, you thought more fire meant more survival. Now you know better. Sometimes you just need a flicker, a coal, a single ember with enough life to start again. You don't fight the cold with noise. You outlast it with strategy. Tonight you set your stones, seal the windows, boil your water, and pull your bedding close to the embers. The fire is small, quiet, but the cabin is warm. That's the trick no one tells you about winter. It's not just what you burn, it's how you keep what you've earned. The cold does strange things to your mind. Not just the dulling of your fingers or the stiffness in your joints, but real, deep, odd shifts in how you think, how you remember. Some mornings you wake and forget what day it is. Some evenings you sit by the fire and catch yourself staring into it so long you lose whole hours. Your brain starts to drift in loops. What did you eat? Did you stoke the fire? Did you dream that noise or actually hear it? And then, almost by reflex, you check the fire again. It's still going. You're still here. But lately your thoughts have turned toward one thing more than any other. The people who had it worse. The ones who survived these winters not as loners, not as grizzled trappers, but as families, as parents. With toddlers crawling across dirt floors and babies crying into blankets frozen stiff at the corners. You think you're cold now? Try nursing an infant in a sod house at 10 below, with no light but a flickering fire and a can of lard for medicine. That's real survival. You start thinking about them constantly. The women who kept their kids alive when half the roof leaked and the flour barrel was down to its last dusty scrape. The old men who kept fires going all night while little ones shivered beside them. How the most vulnerable, the young and the old, weren't afterthoughts. They were the whole reason people endured. You think of one story, something you heard long ago. A settler family in the Minnesota Territory, buried in snow for a week. The parents burned their chairs, their floorboards, the slats from the baby's crib, anything to keep that tiny body warm. They slept in shifts, holding her in turns, passing her like a sacred flame. She lived. The father lost 2 fingers, the mother some of her hearing. But the baby, she lived. And that's the part no one ever writes into the big, sweeping Western epics. Not the shootouts, not the cattle drives. The slow, thankless grind of keeping children alive in a world that wanted to freeze them solid. You take inventory now, wondering what you'd do if a child were here. What would you give up? How would you build differently? Your fire's strong, but is it safe? Is the air inside too smoky? Would a child be warm enough in that corner by the wall? You start rearranging almost unconsciously, pulling the bedding tighter, creating a soft space near the fire pit where someone small could curl up. You cut up an old shirt to make a liner for the blanket, stuffing it with dry grass. You even hang a blanket like a curtain between that space and the rest of the room, just enough to keep it separate, quieter, warmer. Because the thing about kids in winter, especially back then, was that their lives hung on margins. 1 degree too cold, 1 meal too few, 1 missed fire, and that was it. Even now, in this imaginary preparation, it's stressful, and you have no one here, but imagining you did changes everything. You recall how some frontier families prepared for winter specifically around the kids. They dug deeper cellars to store potatoes so children wouldn't starve, sewed miniature coats from leftover scraps, crafted mittens from hide, socks from rabbit fur. They layered cribs with bark beneath the blankets to trap heat. Some families even built smaller cabins just for the children, insulated boxes within boxes where warmth could be focused. Then there were the dangers beyond cold. Smoke inhalation from badly vented stoves, frostbite from sneaking outside to use the outhouse, a child getting too close to the fire and catching a sleeve alight. No safety net, just vigilance. Parents couldn't afford to sleep deeply. The cost was too high. There's a fringe account from an 1874 Nebraska homestead about a boy no older than 5 who learned to stoke the fire before his parents woke up, because both of them had fevers and couldn't move. For 3 days, that child kept them warm, fed them broth made from snow water and a half-dissolved cracker. They all survived. The parents said he never spoke the same after that winter. You imagine what that kind of responsibility would do to a kid, or to you if you were responsible for one, and then you start noticing the details you've been overlooking, how quickly the temperature drops after sunset, how much colder it is near the floor, how long it takes the cabin to warm up again once the fire dies. You jot down a checklist, something to do if, heaven forbid, you ever had to protect someone smaller, weaker, someone counting on you. Reinforce the bedding, pre-warm the sleeping area, set an ember pot near but not close enough to touch. Make sure the bucket of water isn't frozen solid for emergencies. Check the chimney before bed, every night. Scholars sometimes argue that the Wild West myth left out women and children not because they weren't there, but because they didn't fit the story people wanted to tell. Cowboys and outlaws were exciting. Midwives and mothers weren't. But the truth is, more people survived the West because of the women boiling broth and sewing mittens than the men with 6-shooters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. And here's the thing you come to understand sitting by the fire with that blanket curtain rustling gently behind you. Shelter is never just for you. It's for whoever might need it next, even if they never come, even if they're only ghosts in your imagination. So you keep the child's corner, you keep the extra blanket, you keep the routine of checking the fire twice before sleeping, not because you expect anyone, but because this is what people did. This is how they made it. You wrap yourself tightly in your bedding, but your eyes drift toward that little space near the fire one more time before sleep. And for once, the cold feels less like a threat and more like something you're ready for. Not because you're tougher, but because now you're not just surviving for yourself. You wake up to a strange sensation, not fear, not cold, but movement. Just the smallest vibration, like the cabin itself took a breath. You lie still, listening. Then you feel it again. A creak beneath your bedroll, a subtle shift. Not the wind this time, and not the roof groaning under fresh snow. It's under you. That's when you remember. Not all shelters in the West were meant to stay still. Some of them moved. You sit up slowly, muscles stiff, joints clicking like old hinges, and glance around your cabin. Still solid, still standing. But that memory is awake now, clear and unexpected. Those early families and trail crews who never stayed in one place long enough to build walls. Shelters on the move, portable homes, rolling, folding, collapsing, disassembling, ready to be packed up and hauled to wherever the land or weather or opportunity demanded. And suddenly your permanent little cabin feels heavy, like a planted tree that can't run when the fire comes. Back then, mobility meant survival. Homesteaders who failed their first claim sometimes packed up and tried again 50 miles west. Ranch hands travelled with the herd, trappers followed the rivers, and survey crews followed the rails. You didn't always have the luxury of planting roots, and if you wanted shelter, you brought it with you. You throw a blanket over your shoulders and head outside, scanning the snow-blanketed forest for inspiration. The sun's just barely breaking through the clouds, laying pale gold light over the trees. You think about those canvas wagon covers, how they weren't just protection from rain, but became shelter in a pinch. Flip the wagon bed, cover it in oilcloth, prop up a few poles, and you had an instant bunkhouse. Crude, but warmer than the bare prairie. There's a story you once heard about a family in Kansas who lived in their wagon for 6 months after their cabin burned down during a lightning storm. They reinforced the sides with sod and built a small stove from river stones inside the wagon's frame. Said it held better than their house ever did. Not comfortable, not private, but warm enough. Mobile shelter meant you could always follow the resources: game, wood, water, trade. You wander out past the edge of your clearing to a place where you stashed some old lumber, just spare pieces from when you first built your cabin. It gets you thinking. What would it take to make a structure you could disassemble? A framework with pegs instead of nails? Canvas stretched over a wooden skeleton, like a tent with backbone. Could you build something strong enough to hold heat but light enough to carry? You remember that some pioneers did exactly that. Collapsible cabins, also called portable houses, were advertised in some cities before the railroads came through. People ordered them in pieces, hauled them west and assembled them on site. Hinged walls, slotted joints, a stove you could bolt into the floor. There's one account of a travelling preacher who built his chapel this way, collapsed it each time he moved towns like some holy turtle. And then there were the sheep herders, out in Wyoming, Montana, Nevada. They had wagons designed like tiny mobile cabins. Called sheep wagons, they were narrow, rounded on top, and built to survive wind, snow, and long days on the trail. Inside was everything you needed: a bed, a stove, a chest for supplies, even a place to sit and write letters home. They were the original RVS of the American frontier, except with more creaking and fewer luxuries. You decide to try a little experiment. Not a full mobile shelter, you're not going anywhere, but something you could move if you had to. You gather poles, scrap wood, and the old canvas you used to cover your root cellar. You build a basic frame: 4 stakes, a ridgepole, a few crossbars. Then you stretch the canvas over the top, tucking it tight and sealing the base with snow. It looks primitive, but when you crouch inside, it's surprisingly warm. No fire, just body heat. If you had to spend the night in here, you could. And that's the point: having a backup, a way out. Because out here, not all disasters come slowly. A flash thaw could flood your root cellar. A tree could take out your roof. A predator could turn your warm little cabin into a trap. And if that happened, would you run into the woods with nothing but your mittens? Or would you already have a shelter that could follow you? There's still scholarly debate about how many people lived this way: mobile, transient, with homes that folded up or wheeled across miles. Some historians focus on fixed structures, assuming permanence was the goal. Others argue that for many frontier folk, life was always temporary. Seasons changed, fortunes shifted, rivers dried up. A good shelter wasn't one that lasted forever. It was one that lasted long enough to keep you breathing. You stay inside your little makeshift tent for a while, watching the fabric puff and settle with your breath. It smells like canvas and pine smoke, and something about it feels familiar. Not modern, not safe, but old, true. Like you're borrowing a method passed down through 100 winters. Back at your cabin, you build a second version, a lean-to against the back wall. If your door ever freezes shut or the fire smokes you out, you'll have options. Not because you're planning to leave, but because now you can. And you realise, maybe the best shelter isn't a thing you live inside. Maybe it's the knowledge that you could move, rebuild, adapt if you had to. That you're not as stuck as the snow wants you to feel. That night, as the wind howls faintly through the pines, you lie in your cabin with your eyes closed, thinking of wagons rocking across frozen plains, sheep herders boiling coffee in rolling homes, families huddled under canvas, dreaming of land that might not kill them. You're not going anywhere, but now you know you could. The sky darkens fast, too fast. You're halfway back from collecting branches when the first snowflake hits your cheek, fat and wet. Not the usual whispery flakes that drift down lazily like feathers. This one sticks, heavy. You look up and see them coming now in a thick curtain, like someone's shaking out the sky. And that's when your gut tells you you're not getting back to the cabin in time. This is no casual snowfall, this is a whiteout. You spin, trying to judge the distance, trees blurring, trail already gone. In minutes, everything will vanish. The snow thickens, pressing in around you, swallowing sound. You know how this works. People disappear in storms like this, sometimes only 100 yards from home. They panic, run, freeze. A man was found in Nebraska in 1873 curled into a snowdrift 3 steps from his front door, his tracks erased behind him in seconds. So you don't run. You move methodically like a practiced drill. You find shelter. The trees are thinning up ahead, and your visibility is already shrinking to arm's length. You press on toward a small rise you remember, a slight hill with a dip below it, where the land cups inward. You don't think. You act. You dig. You drop to your knees and start carving a hollow in the snowbank with your gloved hands. Every few seconds you pause to listen, nothing but wind, muffled and constant, like a sigh pressed against your ears. Snow packs around you quickly. Good, that's what you need. Cold snow insulates, as counterintuitive as that sounds. It's air trapped in flakes. Once you carve out the middle, the snow will keep the worst of the wind out and your body heat in. Snow caves. You'd read about them. Maybe even laughed about them once. What kind of fool hides inside snow to stay warm? But out here, in a storm like this, it's the only trick you've got. Indigenous hunters use them on the plains, especially when caught far from their camps during sudden squalls. Dig a cavity, crawl inside, survive. You hollow it out slowly, throwing snow behind you. You pack the interior smooth with your hands, careful not to make the roof too thin. Last thing you need is a collapse. Once it's big enough to fit your crouched body, you wriggle inside, feet first, dragging your supplies in behind you. It's not warm exactly, but it's not deadly. The change is immediate. Outside, roaring white, screaming wind. Inside, silence. The snow becomes walls. A womb. Your breath fills the air, warm and damp, frosting the ceiling just inches above your face. You pull your scarf tighter, press your knees to your chest, and wait. Settlers caught in blizzards often didn't have this knowledge. They tried to build fires which melted the snow and collapsed their shelters, or they kept walking, thinking movement meant survival. But snow blindness and confusion made short work of direction. They circled, collapsed, froze. Entire schoolhouses of children died within sight of safety because they left too soon or too late. You remember reading about the Children's Blizzard of 1888? Yes, the same winter you've been dancing with all season. It struck the Midwest just as kids were being let out of school. Temperatures dropped 40 degrees in an hour. Teachers tried to lead them home. Some made it. Others didn't. The lucky ones found haystacks, caves, even hollow logs to crawl inside until morning. Makeshift shelters, snow caves, anything. It's hard to say how long you're in yours. Minutes stretch strangely when you're half frozen. You count your breath. You check your fingers, your toes. You resist the urge to fall asleep. You've heard the stories. Sleep in the snow too long and you wake up nowhere. So you focus. You remind yourself that snow insulates but also breathes. You've left a small hole behind you for airflow, barely the width of 2 fingers. It's enough. You hope. And here's the strange part. After a while, you start to feel okay. Not warm exactly, but stable. Like the cold has stopped trying to kill you and started tolerating you. Your heartbeat slows. Your thoughts unfreeze. You're still in control. Fringe survivalists have practiced these exact scenarios for years. Some even teach courses on it. There are heated debates in the cold weather community about whether snow caves are more effective than ice tents, or whether igloo-style shelters offer better weight distribution. You don't care about any of that right now. You're just glad your fingers are still moving. Eventually the snow outside begins to lessen. You can hear the wind taper down, no longer snarling through the trees. You press gently at your entryway. The wall gives. You push, and light filters in, a dull grey glow that feels like sunrise. You claw your way out slowly, blinking as the white world returns. Everything is blanketed. The forest is new. Your trail is long gone, but your legs still work. You mark your snow cave with a broken branch, just in case, and begin walking. Slowly, deliberately. You triangulate your position by the slope of the land, the angle of the light, the vague familiarity of a bent tree you passed hours ago. After some time, an hour, maybe 2, you see it. The shape of your cabin, rising like a ghost from the drift. You almost laugh, almost cry. Inside, everything is as you left it. Fire low, but embers alive. You strip off your wet layers and wrap yourself in wool, shivering but grateful. And now you know something you didn't before. You don't always need a cabin. You don't always need walls or stoves or a roof. Sometimes you just need a way to stay still long enough for the danger to pass. Sometimes shelter is a pocket of silence in a storm, and it's enough. You've noticed something that sneaks in once the sun sets and the fire burns low. Something harder to fight than frostbite or hunger or howling wind. It comes when the chores are done, the kettle's quiet, the embers are red and pulsing like the last heartbeat in the room. You sit in silence, no pressing danger outside, no immediate problem inside. And that's when it hits. The ache. Not physical, not even emotional exactly. It's mental. A weariness in your bones that has nothing to do with labour. It's loneliness. No, not the kind you feel during the day when you're busy and focused and moving. This one's different. It's heavier at night. The cold keeps your body alert, but your mind, it wanders. It plays tricks. Memories feel louder in here. Doubts creep in with the drafts. And if you're not careful, that silence will pull you apart thread by thread. So like those who survived before you, you turn to one of the oldest shelters of all, storytelling. It starts simple. You talk out loud, narrating what you're doing. Stoking the fire again. You chuckle at your own commentary, even if it's mostly to keep from slipping into the quiet too far. Then you start telling stories. First the ones you remember. Campfire tales, childhood legends, half-true family histories you swore you forgot. You sit cross-legged on your bedroll, lit by the fire's red light, and you speak them into the dark. And it works. Somehow it works. Because out here, words fill the space where people used to be. Settlers knew this. Indigenous families too. Fireside storytelling wasn't a hobby. It was preservation of sanity, culture, hope. In a one-room cabin in the dead of winter with snow stacked to the eaves and wolves circling beyond the trees, a story was more than entertainment. It was structure, something that gave shape to the endless dark. There's a record from 1869 of a widow and her 3 children who were snowed in for 5 weeks in Colorado. They ran out of flour in the 3rd week, burned the last of their furniture in the 4th. But the part the oldest daughter remembered most? Her mother's nightly stories. Every evening, without fail, her mother would sit at the hearth and tell tales of kings and forests, of rivers that healed, and heroes who returned home. She made the cold seem farther away, the daughter wrote years later. You understand that now. You feel it. Soon, you start inventing your own stories. Characters cobbled together from memory and imagination. Plot lines that spiral out as you sip your last bit of tea, staring into flame. You give names to the squirrels you've seen darting through the snow. You imagine their societies, their rules, their little dramas. You narrate their lives as if you're some omniscient forest god. It sounds ridiculous, but it passes the time. It keeps your mind moving instead of shrinking. Some nights, you speak to those who aren't there. A sibling, a parent, a friend from a life that feels farther away with each day. You imagine their responses. You picture their faces when you describe your latest near-death snow cave adventure, or the ridiculous way your socks froze into boots again. You smile. You laugh. You breathe easier. This isn't madness, this is maintenance, and it wasn't just you. Out west, during long winters, storytelling became its own currency. Trappers in shared bunkhouses would swap ghost stories or tall tales while their boots dried by the fire. Homesteaders would take turns spinning yarns to distract the kids from hunger. Even railroad workers built entire oral epics around the mountains they crossed, and the spirits they claimed lived in the rock. It made the world feel a little less empty, a little more human. You think of one particularly strange legend, the tale of the Snow Woman of the Bitterroots, told by Montana settlers and adapted from native myths. She was said to drift across blizzards barefoot, whispering warnings to those about to freeze. If you followed her voice, you'd survive. If you ignored it, you'd wake up buried in white. Scholars still debate whether the story was invented to scare children into staying near camp, or whether sightings were real hallucinations during extreme cold exposure. Either way, she lives on, in fireside tales, in cautionary whispers, in survival instincts. You catch yourself telling her story one night, aloud to no one, and shiver a little. Not from fear, but from how real she feels in that moment. That's the power of it. Stories become the second fire in the room. Eventually you start keeping a small journal, nothing formal, just scratches in a notebook you found wedged between your supplies. You jot down the stories that come to you, the things you tell the fire. You figure maybe one day someone will read it. Maybe 100 years from now some historian will find your notes and say, So that's what it was like. You smile at the thought. You're not surviving anymore, you're recording. And this, you realise, is the last kind of shelter people built during those impossible winters. Not walls or roofs, not stone or sod, but memory, language, lore. You build a house out of words, one sentence at a time, and it shields you from the cold in ways even fire can't. Tonight, after the fire is banked low and the wind has calmed, you light a candle stub and sit by it, notebook open. You write slowly, with gloved hands, about a man who learned to stay warm by listening to the trees, about a child who built a cabin inside a dream, about a storm that forgot where to land. You don't care if they make sense. You just write. You speak aloud as you do it. Your voice is a little hoarse from disuse but steady. The sound wraps around you like a blanket. And the night? It's still long, still cold. But you've made yourself a little room inside it. By now you know the rhythms, the exact sound of the fire when it's burning too low, the way the snow outside absorbs every noise until the world feels like a thick-walled vault, the creak of the roof timbers expanding when the sun finally hits them after days of cold. You've lived with winter so long now it doesn't feel like something you're fighting. It feels like something you're wearing. Heavy, yes, but familiar. Part of you. You step outside and the light stings your eyes. The snow has stopped, and what's left glitters like a frozen sea, rolling white hills that break only where tree limbs claw their way into the sky. You move slowly, not from fatigue but from caution. Because even now, even at the tail end of the season, you know that the struggle isn't finished. Not really. You walk the perimeter of your shelter, tracing the compacted trails your boots have made over and over again like a ritual. The windbreak is still holding. The snowdrift you carved a path through is now a wall twice your height, its sides sheer and smooth like sculpted marble. You glance up at the roof, your patched tarp weighted with snow, still sagging but intact. And yet, despite the signs of success, something in you feels worn thin. Not weak, exactly, but stretched. Winter hasn't broken you, but it hasn't left you unmarked either. Inside, the cabin still smells of smoke, leather, and boiled root vegetables. You sit at the small table you slap together from split logs and take stock. The food is low. You're down to the dregs of flour, 2 dried apples, half a smoked rabbit, and 1 stubborn onion that seems determined to never rot or ripen. The firewood stack is a little taller than your knee, maybe 5 days left at full burn, longer if you stretch it. Water you can melt from snow. But all the numbers add up to one thing. The end is in sight. Not the end of winter exactly, but the point at which you know you'll make it. And that brings with it a strange feeling. Not triumph, not relief, something closer to disbelief. You remember the day you arrived, bright-eyed, half-stupid, dragging supplies you barely knew how to use. You thought a few walls and a fire would be enough. You didn't know about wind, about smoke that wouldn't draw, about frostbite in your knuckles or frozen boots you had to beat back to life with a rock. But now you do. You remember each makeshift fix like a badge, the moss you crammed into the walls, the hot stones rotated through your bedding, the windbreak built from scavenged lumber, the snow cave you clawed out with your bare hands. Each one was a decision, a choice to stay, a refusal to give in. There's an old debate among historians. Did people survive these winters because of resilience or because of luck? Because they knew what they were doing, or because they simply refused to stop trying? Maybe the truth isn't in the reason. Maybe it's in the repetition, the willingness to do the same hard things over and over every day until the weather changes. And yet, the hardest part? It wasn't the cold, it was the silence, the stillness, the time. Time to think about all the other lives you might have lived. Time to wonder if you made a mistake. Time to sit by the fire with no one to talk to, telling yourself stories to keep your mind from splintering. Time to doubt. Time to fear. Time to hope too much or not at all. You walk over to the fire and stir it, then kneel to add a log. The flames catch with a satisfying sigh. You watch the orange tongues lick up the wood, spreading heat that reaches your bones. There's something ceremonial in that moment. You're not just building a fire, you're finishing a season. Outside, the snow is starting to soften. Not enough to melt, just enough to hint. The trees drip slowly. A crow calls from somewhere far off. The wind is less sharp, more like a breeze than a blade. You press your palm to the cabin wall and feel the sun's warmth leaking through. It's faint, but real. In town, they'd call this the thaw. In journals, they'd say, spring is arriving. But out here, it feels more like a breath finally released after months of holding it. You think back to the others who came before you. Fur trappers, homesteaders, ranch families, wanderers who didn't leave behind buildings but left behind knowledge, tricks, systems, hard-won experience. You were never alone, not really. You walked trails they'd carved, even if they're buried in snow now. And someday, someone might follow yours. There's one last task to do. You take your notebook, the one with the fire stories, the snow cave memory, the names you gave the squirrels, and add one more entry. This one isn't dramatic. No heroics. Just a note. The roof held. The fire held. I held. And that's enough. Because survival isn't always about what you fought off. Sometimes it's just about what you carried forward. A shelter, a story, a skill, something passed on. You close the book. The fire crackles. The snow outside shimmers. Tomorrow you'll start preparing for the melt. You'll dig out the root cellar. Patch what needs patching. Maybe even take a walk beyond the ridge. See how the rest of the world is waking up. But tonight, you sit by the fire one more time. You look around at what you've built, what you've patched, what you've learned. You feel the quiet settle. Not the dangerous kind, but the earned kind. And for the first time in months, you don't need to brace yourself against the dark. You just let it fall. By now you know the rhythms, the exact sound of the fire when it's burning too low, the way the snow outside absorbs every noise until the world feels like a thick-walled vault. The creak of the roof timbers expanding when the sun finally hits them after days of cold. You've lived with winter so long now it doesn't feel like something you're fighting. It feels like something you're wearing. Heavy, yes, but familiar. Part of you. You step outside and the light stings your eyes. The snow has stopped, and what's left glitters like a frozen sea, rolling white hills that break only where tree limbs claw their way into the sky. You move slowly, not from fatigue but from caution, because even now, even at the tail end of the season, you know that the struggle isn't finished. Not really. You walk the perimeter of your shelter, tracing the compacted trails your boots have made over and over again like a ritual. The windbreak is still holding. The snowdrift you carved a path through is now a wall twice your height, its sides sheer and smooth like sculpted marble. You glance up at the roof, your patched tarp, weighted with snow, still sagging but intact. And yet, despite the signs of success, something in you feels worn thin. Not weak, exactly, but stretched. Winter hasn't broken you, but it hasn't left you unmarked either. Inside, the cabin still smells of smoke, leather, and boiled root vegetables. You sit at the small table you slapped together from split logs and take stock. The food is low. You're down to the dregs of flour, 2 dried apples, half a smoked rabbit, and 1 stubborn onion that seems determined to never rot or ripen. The firewood stack is a little taller than your knee, maybe 5 days left at full burn, longer if you stretch it. Water you can melt from snow. But all the numbers add up to one thing. The end is in sight. Not the end of winter exactly, but the point at which you know you'll make it. And that brings with it a strange feeling. Not triumph, not relief, something closer to disbelief. You remember the day you arrived, bright-eyed, half-stupid, dragging supplies you barely knew how to use. You thought a few walls and a fire would be enough. You didn't know about wind, about smoke that wouldn't draw, about frostbite in your knuckles or frozen boots you had to beat back to life with a rock. But now you do. You remember each makeshift fix like a badge. The moss you crammed into the walls, the hot stones rotated through your bedding, the windbreak built from scavenged lumber, the snow cave you clawed out with your bare hands. Each one was a decision, a choice to stay, a refusal to give in. There's an old debate among historians. Did people survive these winters because of resilience or because of luck? Because they knew what they were doing, or because they simply refused to stop trying? Maybe the truth isn't in the reason. Maybe it's in the repetition, the willingness to do the same hard things over and over every day until the weather changes. And yet, the hardest part? It wasn't the cold. It was the silence, the stillness, the time. Time to think about all the other lives you might have lived. Time to wonder if you made a mistake. Time to sit by the fire with no one to talk to, telling yourself stories to keep your mind from splintering. Time to doubt. Time to fear. time to hope too much or not at all. You walk over to the fire and stir it, then kneel to add a log. The flames catch with a satisfying sigh. You watch the orange tongues lick up the wood, spreading heat that reaches your bones. There's something ceremonial in that moment. You're not just building a fire, you're finishing a season. Outside, the snow is starting to soften. Not enough to melt, just enough to hint. The trees drip slowly. A crow calls from somewhere far off. The wind is less sharp, more like a breeze than a blade. You press your palm to the cabin wall and feel the sun's warmth leaking through. It's faint, but real. In town, they'd call this the thaw. In journals, they'd say, spring is arriving. But out here, it feels more like a breath finally released after months of holding it. You think back to the others who came before you. Fur trappers, homesteaders, ranch families, wanderers who didn't leave behind buildings but left behind knowledge, tricks, systems, hard-won experience. You were never alone, not really. You walked trails they had carved, even if they're buried in snow now. And someday, someone might follow yours. There's one last task to do. You take your notebook, the one with the fire stories, the snow cave memory, the names you gave the squirrels, and add one more entry. This one isn't dramatic. No heroics, just a note. The roof held. The fire held, I held, and that's enough. Because survival isn't always about what you fought off. Sometimes it's just about what you carried forward. A shelter, a story, a skill, something passed on. You close the book. The fire crackles, the snow outside shimmers. Tomorrow you'll start preparing for the melt. You'll dig out the root cellar, patch what needs patching. Maybe even take a walk beyond the ridge, see how the rest of the world is waking up. But tonight, you sit by the fire one more time. You look around at what you've built, what you've patched, what you've learned. You feel the quiet settle, not the dangerous kind, but the earned kind. And for the first time in months, you don't need to brace yourself against the dark. You just let it fall. So now, with the snow softening and the world exhaling, you lean back and let yourself feel something rare out here. Stillness without fear. Not the silence that stalked you in the deep of winter. Not the kind that whispered doubts into your ear at night, but a quieter kind. A closing of the book kind. Your shelter stands, not perfect, not pretty, but standing. You made it through the blizzards, the black nights, the creaking of beams under too much snow. You figured out how to trap heat with mud and moss, how to sleep with ember pots tucked beneath your blanket, how to tell stories loud enough to keep the loneliness from freezing your brain. And that matters, because out here, every lesson is earned. Every survival is its own kind of legacy. You're part of a chain now, stretching back through time, through trappers and trail hands, pioneer mothers warming babies in root cellars, ranchers repairing broken bunkhouses with frostbitten fingers. They built more than cabins. They built methods, myths, memory. And now, so have you. Tomorrow you'll break down the windbreak. You'll crack open the ice in the bucket for the last time. You might even open the door and let the cabin breathe, just to hear the birds argue in the trees again. But tonight you sit by your fire one last time this season, let the flicker play against the walls you've come to know like your own skin, and close your eyes with the surest peace of all. The knowledge that you didn't just survive winter, you made it respect you. The fire fades, the wind is soft, the stories are yours now. Good night.